Chapter 36, Hexcarnate, Family Secret. Chapter text present for Christmas, since there had been so many witnesses to the confrontation with the Fey warriors at Hogsmeade. There was no way to keep it out of the papers, and the ministry had advised avoiding travel on the 21st lest the flu go down again. Fortunately, that was the day after the Hogwarts Express went home, so the exodus from school was only the usual madhouse. My friends wished me good luck before they left, and Mathilda said she'd owl with revised plans if the flu wasn't available. Hogwarts was functionally empty once everyone left. With the combination of black, dementors, and Fey armies seen around the school, there were basically zero parents who thought their children would be safe there. Besides me, the only remaining students were two first-years whose parents hadn't gotten the memo, and poor Irving Cram, the fifth-year Slytherin prefect, whose family seemed to be going through a very rare pureblood divorce if the rumors were to be believed. He'd been sullen in the defense class I subbed for back in October, and he seemed even worse after being stranded at school for the holidays. That left a very order-centric lineup of professors in the building, however. I wasn't sure Dumbledore, McGonagall, or Flitwick had homes beyond the school. Hagrid definitely didn't. Remus also decided to stay, which was a large part of the reason why I was, but had managed to get permission for Tonks to spend a large part of the holidays at the school as aura protection, and Moody tagged along as well. I suspected he didn't have much of an extended family to spend the holidays with, regardless. About the only adults in the building that I wasn't sure were in Dumbledore's secret cabal were Sprout, Filch, and Trelawney. Moody took advantage of it. He had detailed plans for magical combat drills to prepare us all for battle with the various Fey beings we suspected were in the She army, as well as the She themselves. The paranoid old aura clearly felt like he hadn't been vigilant enough about threats from fairy tales, and had a lot of ground to catch up on. I hoped the Room of Requirement didn't have the ability to report this training back to Maeve, because I couldn't exactly articulate my reasons for why we shouldn't use it for the drills. To no one's great surprise, the flu went out again on Tuesday night at midnight. After it was confirmed at breakfast on Wednesday, I took Bob up to the top of the astronomy tower and had him scan the veil like he had the year previous. This is a much better view than Remus' house, Harry. The skull-bound spirit enthused. They're definitely using somewhere in Ireland as their gateway. The cracks seem to be radiating out from that direction. How bad is it? I asked. Not too much worse than last year. They probably had less resistance to shove out whatever came through this time, but that meant there was less damage to the veil. They may not be able to shatter it completely this way. Maybe if they started shoving big things through it all the wraths. But what about small things? Oh, yeah, definitely, he confirmed. They probably have to work to get she nobles into the world still, because they have more metaphysical scale, and the veil is specifically trying to keep them out. But some of the smaller stuff might have hardly any trouble slipping through. That's about what I figured, I grumbled. Small was relative, and probably included things like the wargs and lucrata from the Never Never. Luna had already warned me that she'd been seeing more of her tiny pests floating around the world in the last year. Hopefully, the Department of Mysteries was finally taking fixing things seriously. I still hadn't told the professors about Bob, because I was worried they'd want to take him from me for safety or study. Fortunately, they were willing to give me a lot of leeway about where I was getting my information on the Fae, and didn't need to know that I could talk about this because of my secret research spirit, and not because I had somehow gotten around a gesh. Vale isn't too much worse, apparently, I told the Order at our afternoon sparring session. They may have broken it enough last year that it has more flexibility now, but they definitely brought in more heavy hitters last night, somewhere in Ireland. Probably one of those warded-era strongpoints, Moody growled. The Muggle government wouldn't be having half as much problem dealing with them if they didn't have those bolt holes. We couldn't even do much but confirm that magic was involved when they asked our lot for help, probably more fairy assistance. There's a Muggle connection to the ministry, I asked. The old Aura agreed. Yep. Doesn't get used much, but there are a few people, like the Muggle Prime Minister, who get to know. I bet old Fudge hated to admit that something magical was going on, but he had no idea what to do about it. As promised, other than the disruption of the veil, There was no immediate follow-up attack. I wondered whether the Weisengammer was actually planning to negotiate, or whether they were just going to wait for the Fae to make their next move. I suspected the latter. At least, they managed to get the flu fixed quickly this time, and long-distance apparition had never really gotten better. I wasn't totally sure how they'd managed to get long-distance portkeys working again. Maybe the use of an enchanted item provided enough power to jump over the cracks. Soon, it was Christmas, and Dumbledore had once again had the elves redirect my presents to the foot of my bed. This year, my gifts to my friends had been part of a set. Using the book Dumbledore had given me the year previous about protean enchantments, and an idea from Hermione, passed through the Lord of the Rings, I'd made everyone rings that could be used with a simple spell to send a short text message that would fill the inside of the band of everyone else's ring. They also could be activated to glow with the equivalent of a lighting charm, since it bothered me that a wand user couldn't really cast anything else while using the focus as a flashlight. And I'd added another secret failsafe. And yes, mine was the one ring to rule them all. Mostly, it just controlled when the rings were all connected versus when my age group was kept on a different network than Hermione's. I'd also tried to give Mathilda's a few more enchantments, because it didn't hurt to pay special attention to one's gift for one's girlfriend. We, of course, hadn't been super serious when I'd decided to do rings for everyone, and I wasn't sure how that would get interpreted. My favorite present that I received was from Percy and Penny. They'd gotten the Macintosh store in Manchester that we used to flew to Penny's house to custom, make me a weatherproof canvas coat that would pass as either wizard's robes or a muggle long coat. The note indicated that the proprietor initially didn't believe the measurements they'd given him, until he remembered how tall I was from the few times I'd been to the shop. I already had big plans for the defensive enchanting I could do with a multi-purpose piece of outerwear. I finally received a highly coveted Weasley family sweater, a big blue H on the brown background, and Mrs. Weasley had even got the arms long enough to fit my oversized frame. I wondered how many of these she'd wound up making if everyone that went on the trip over the summer was family now. The most surprising present was from Filch, the caretaker. In the last year, sometimes when I'd stayed almost to curfew, just working in the enchanting lab by myself, he'd joined me and just quietly sketched by the fire while I petted Mrs. Norris, his cat. I'd gradually realized that he was a bit of an artist, and part of his role in the castle was to clean and restore the magical paintings. It was something even a squib could do, and in fact, cleaning charms didn't work well on magical art. I was shocked to open the flat-wrapped present that was a foot wide by a foot and a half tall, and find a very nice portrait of me deeply focused on my enchanting work. He must have been making reference sketches the whole time. The note indicated that he'd done all the proper prep, so a wizard portrait maker could easily perform the final steps to invest it with part of my personality and make a proper wizarding portrait that would animate and talk after I died. That step was a little morbid, but it was certainly the most personal gift I'd ever received. After replacing his familiar bond charm the previous year, with one that actually had some failsafes built in to try to safely dissipate feedback if Mrs. Norris got attacked again. This year, I'd added a new minor item to his repertoire. Most of the school, but the twins in particular, probably wouldn't like that I'd given him a modified sneakoscope that was designed as a compass that would point out nearby troublemakers. I'd also gotten the usual trio of mystery gifts. The book on Transfiguration the year before had been a big clue that McGonagall was one of my unsigned gifters. I still wasn't sure why she was singling me out among the students for gifts, but she got me a book on handy skills for new bachelors as a big hint that I'd have to be out in the world on my own pretty soon. I'd gotten her a really cool cat statue from Egypt. Dumbledore had got me a nice edition of a book of wizarding, fairy tales, that looked to be much closer to the original sources than the more recent books for children, and might genuinely have some insight into Fae politics. After hearing how much he liked socks, I got him a set of very nice Egyptian cotton ones from a trader on our vacation. Finally, my godmother's present was an actual non-conjured tuxedo robe and another invitation to the Malfoy ball. I wondered if she had something new to inflict on me, or if she'd just seen how much Mathilda enjoyed it the year before. Preempting her this time, I'd also sent a present care of Draco, a set of muggle books on tradecraft and disguise. I wasn't actually sure I wanted her to get better, but it was a fun in-joke after her poor attempts at blending as a servant at the last year's ball, and I wanted our gifting to stay balanced. And of course, I had another set of clothes. Not quite a tuxedo, but a very nice set of robes appropriate for fancy meetings, job interviews, or nice restaurants. And it was clearly intended for all three, basically, since it was from Mathilda. After all, I had a new doom hanging over my head. On Boxing Day, I was finally going to meet her parents. Parental units had gotten special permission to use Dumbledore's flu to visit the Grimblehawks, both because nobody thought it would be safe for me to come back to Hogsmeade after dark, and because the old man was twinkling up a storm about the whole thing. Ah, it must be getting quite serious to be having Boxing Day dinner with young Mathilda's parents, he suggested. To give my best to Nicholas and Bridget. The house I tumbled out of the fireplace into after requesting Grimblehawk Manor was more or less what I'd expected. Not nearly as big as Malfoy Manor, the den was still large and appointed with antique furniture. Hanging from all the old, polished wooden walls were many animated paintings of magical beasts and portraits of presumed ancestors. Several of them immediately began quietly critiquing me to their neighboring paintings. Ah, Dresden, full early. Abraham Grimblehawk stated, looking up from reading his newspaper. He put on a more upscale set of robes than the durable creature-wrangling outfit I'd usually seen him in, but his magnificent white mutton chops were still the same, much longer than his relatively short head hair. "Oh, good evening, sir," I told him. "I hadn't expected." "Ah, of course not. You've been set up. Thought you were just going to meet Nick and Brid, eh? Those two don't go anywhere together. That's not accorded neutral territory. Hence, welcome to my home." I'd been vaguely aware that, like Irving Cram, Mathilda had one of the few sets of divorced parents in the pureblood world, but I hadn't thought through the ramifications. She hadn't said I was meeting her father and stepmother. Just her parents, though, right. I may have squeaked the last word. He just shook his head. "They told me to set the dining room for 9. I think you're getting pretty much everybody. Fire whiskey." "I'd better not," I demurred. I would probably need all of my wits about me for this surprise. "Suit yourself," he shrugged, pouring his own glass with a generous amount of brown liquor from a small but well-stocked bar in the corner of the room. He took a sip and explained, "I certainly don't want to spend the evening with Bridget and Rhiannon in the same room without fortification." To hide my nervousness, I went and glanced out of a large window onto a large lawn with a fieldstone fence at the top of a hill overlooking a lightly forested neighborhood of wide-spaced other houses. I was able to make out a little of the rest of the house, which clearly was a large country house faced with dark brick. "So this is Wales?" I asked. "No, good old England." He joined me by the window. "Sheffield's the closest big city that way. Manchester is about twice as far the other. Nick lives in Rhiannon's family house in Wales. Mathilda was mostly raised over there." "So you're the head of the family?" I asked. Technically. Never did get around to settling down. Just me and the house elves bouncing around in this big old place. I'll probably pass it to young Edgar and downsize eventually," he explained, finishing off his drink. Given how old he looked, I realized that I wasn't actually sure whether Abraham was Mathilda's great-uncle, and that hadn't cleared it up at all. Of course, they're free to use it for events like this. The fire in the fireplace turned green. Speaking of, Mathilda tumbled out of the fireplace in a Christmassy dress-like set of robes. "Harry." She moved forward and gave me a hug, then hugged Abraham, warning us both, "Mum and Edith incoming." I vaguely recalled that Edith was one of her sisters, and the conservatively dressed witch that stepped out of the fire looked only a decade older, so probably wasn't Mum. More solidly built and shorter in contrast to Mathilda, she had the same dark eyes and reddish-brown hair, though her hair was pinned in a tight bun. "Uncle Abraham." She gave the old man a hug with the greeting. "Mr. Dresden." She gave me an appraising look before grudgingly offering her hand to shake. "Giselle can't make it," Mathilda explained, more to her uncle than me. "She had to go right back on call." I must have looked confused, since I hadn't heard much about her other sister. She's an apprentice veterinary healer. She was lucky to get Christmas Day off. Magical beasts don't take the holiday off injuring themselves and getting sick. I'm happy to just do the accounting, Edith said. The fire flared again, and a woman that had to be Mathilda's mother stepped through. Firmly middle-aged, she had the slighter build that Mathilda had, though was even shorter than Edith. Her hair was a darker brown than her daughter's, though she had the same brown eyes. I wasn't exactly a judge of wizarding fashion, but I felt like she dressed a little fancier than was expected for a family dinner, with a decent amount of jewelry on display, and perhaps a bit more skin than was normal for December, with her robes cut to show that she was still in excellent shape for a woman her age. Not that I was checking her out, but the guys at school had suggested, if her mum's still fit, she will be by that age too, and it was hard to ignore that kind of advice. Abraham, she acknowledged the host somewhat coolly, and then turned to me, and you must be Harry, so glad to finally meet you. She held out her hand, and after a glance to Mathilda to confirm, I took it and kissed the back. Ah, good manners, at least. Her accent was much more traditionally British than Mathilda's Welsh pronunciation. Come to think of it, Edith's was more received pronunciation as well. She turned back to Abraham after sizing me up and asked, "Are they here yet?" "Still waiting, I'm afraid," he explained. "But we can go ahead to the dining room. Nick knows the way." I noticed he had filled another glass of whiskey while I'd been meeting the two new women and clutched it like a life preserver as he led the way into the house. I was immediately almost totally forgotten by Mathilda's mother as she moved ahead to query Abraham about the rest of the family. My girlfriend, for her part, took my arm and explained quietly, "Mum hasn't seen Dad since Giselle graduated. 4 years ago, she has questions. She wants to know if Rhiannon's gotten fat, most likely," Edith explained. "So, Dresden, tell me about your Doom of Damocles." "Edith," Mathilda argued. "It's fine." I squeezed her arm as we walked through the upstairs gallery, which had even more old portraits. It was interesting that there was no evidence of any taxidermied beasts. Given the family's proclivities, it made sense that they weren't big game hunters, even though it would have been expected in the decor. My mentor was trying to do a ritual to get me possessed by Voldemort. I waited for the gasp, but Edith just raised an eyebrow. I didn't use the safest spell in the world to get out. House burned down. One of his former students is an aura who refuses to believe he was bad and has it out for me. It sucks. She eventually allowed, apparently satisfied. "And you're not teaching Mathilda the dark arts." "Edith, he's helping teach defense against the dark arts. He and our friends have already invented 2 new light spells. He fights Death Eaters all the time." "So you're going to be an aura when you graduate?" Edith asked. I shrugged. Probably not with the Doom. I always kind of wanted to be a private investigator, but I don't think wizards really have those. "Like in cast a deadly spell?" Edith asked. I nodded. I hadn't realized she'd have been as interested in the family practice of watching Muggle fantasy movies as Mathilda was. "Seems interesting, but financially risky. You're not planning on just living on Mathilda's trust fund, are you?" "I can honestly say I had no idea your family was wealthy until a couple months ago," I told her, skipping the worrying implication about marriage or at least long-term cohabitation. "The money's all from the Welsh dragon breeding grounds?" I asked, as we finally made it to the large dining room. Their mother had already taken a seat near the head of the table and answered, "Ha, no, that's the Cadogan lands. Those belong to Rhiannon's family." "Like Sir Cadogan, the excitable knight in the portrait at school?" I asked. He would frequently challenge students to duels, and no one could figure out how he planned to fight them. "An ancestor, I'm afraid," a woman's voice cut in from the doorway. She was probably barely 30 and blonde, but also had dark eyes and didn't look like any of the other women in the room. Unlike Mathilda's mother, her presumable stepmother wasn't especially dressed up, but was equally slender. She was escorting 2 young boys who immediately reminded me of the Creevy brothers with their light brown hair. I guess the older was 9 or 10, at least a year before Hogwarts, and the younger a couple years behind him. "You must be Harry. Pleased to meet you. I'm Rhiannon, and this is Edgar and Robert." She shook my hand politely and greeted, "Abraham, Edith, Bridget." Fortunately, Mathilda's mother's harumph was drowned out by the boys shouting, "Thilda, Thilda," and immediately dragging her off to explain what they'd gotten for Christmas. It was Bridget's year for holidays with the girls, so they haven't seen her yet. "Sorry," Rhiannon explained, smiling. I got a sense that the relaxed, friendly air that she was putting on was at least partly affectation to show that the older woman wasn't going to get to her. Nick should have been right behind me. Just fixing a drink, love, a man's voice explained as he entered from the hallway with his own tumbler of whiskey. He was tall and stoutly built, especially around the middle, wearing his red-brown hair in a lion's mane and a full beard. Significantly older than his second wife, he gave me a look up and down, apparently didn't hate me on sight, and immediately ignored me to ask, "Where are my girls?" "I think he was just making sure you weren't a Death Eater or ugly," Rhiannon smiled. "We trust Mathilda's judgment, but I'm sure he'll pay more attention to you when he's caught up with everyone else. It's hard not seeing them for the holidays, especially since we got so little time with her over the summer." "Yeah, sorry about that." I rubbed the back of my head. "I thought she'd have a parent along to chaperone. Most of the other kids did. Unfortunately, I didn't have time due to the boys. Nick had to work, and I'm sure Bridget wouldn't be caught dead on an adventure." Mathilda's mother seemed to overhear enough to shoot daggers at Rhiannon and then turn back to talking at her ex-husband about something. I shrugged and asked, "I was asking about your family because I thought Mathilda was Welsh and the Grimblehawks own the breeding grounds." "No, they're originally Hungarian. The Jindal moved here around a century ago and anglicized the name. Abraham was first-generation English, and Nick is second. I guess that confirmed that Abraham was the great-uncle. They still own Hungarian horntail breeding grounds. I met Nick through that connection. Only a few European families in the dragon business." She shrugged. "We married when Mathilda was about 5, and they moved into my family's estate. So I guess she picked up the language and the accent. She still sounds very English to me." "Soups," Abraham announced, trying to get everyone to sit down. I wound up crammed at Abraham's end of the table across from Mathilda and next to Rhiannon, watching the politics play out. Edgar, the older little boy, took his father's right, and Bridget had already claimed the left. Dinner wasn't actually as bad as I'd feared, since the dynamics on display weren't actually worried about me. I'd occasionally get a drive-by question once someone remembered I was there, but it was mostly about the byplay of the ex-wife and her daughters getting to muscle in on the territory of the new wife. Mostly, it helped me understand my girlfriend a lot better. Nicholas Grimblehawk had clearly wanted sons. It honestly felt a lot like the Weasleys having so many boys to try to get a daughter. When Bridget had 3 girls, he moved on. With the way she talked about their careers, Bridget clearly cared more about her elder daughters, rather than Mathilda, who'd been half-raised by her stepmother. Meanwhile, the way her father doted on the young sons, it wasn't any wonder he didn't care that she'd spent most of the summer in Egypt with her new boyfriend. It made sense that she'd told me about her uncle Abraham long before she told me anything about anyone else, since following him into magizoology was a way to stand out to someone. As a kid who hadn't had a family and kind of dreamed of one like this, I was beginning to realize how lonely it could be. It was interesting that my closest friends, Mathilda and Percy, were both solidly middle children, lost between the elder achievers and the much-desired youngest. I'm sure she wouldn't trade it for my situation, but there had to be a special hell in having so many people who loved you, but being the absolute last priority for every one of them. When the dinner finally finished, Abraham drunk off of his chair and Nicholas getting there, I managed to catch a few moments alone with Mathilda. "Malfoy ball again?" I asked her. "Exciting. Maybe we'll get to see the next crop of bad fairies." "Hopefully not," I frowned, realizing she could be right. "I have a suit this time that's not conjured, at least. I still think there's a market for party clothes that evaporate at the right time," she grinned. "My suit has 5 more minutes, so we need to get home now," I joked. She giggled a bit, then said, "Did you have an okay time? I know they're a lot. I appreciate you coming." "It was good. I think I learned a lot about you. Thanks for showing me," I told her, wrapping her in a hug. "And I'm sorry if they don't always see you." "I do." She gave me a kiss and said, "I know. Your detective skills are just one of the many things I like about you." She thought for a second. "I'm still not sure there's any money in being a pie. I'm not even sure private auras are legal. You sure you don't want to teach defense next year?" I shook my head. "Remus just needs to make it a couple more months, and counting spring term last year, he'll be the longest defense professor in forever. I don't think I could steal that from him." Family secret. Harry Dresden. What a surprise meeting you here. Rita Skeeter announced from the bar at the Three Broomsticks, where she was sipping some elaborate mixed drink while dressed in her party finest. I knew I should have booked at the last second, I grumbled, and Rosmita gave me an apologizing look after handing me my room key. I decided to go down to the inn in the afternoon of New Year's Eve, travel from there to Malfoy Manor, and plan to stay there until the morning rather than prevailing on Dumbledore to use his fireplace at 3 in the morning. He already wasn't super happy about me going to the ball, except as a potential information-gathering exercise. I was honestly hoping to learn as little as possible. Mathilda had a really good time the previous year and wanted to go again. I could do with less politics. So, Rita said, getting up and chivying me over to a table in the sparsely populated tavern area. I could have resisted, but I did still kind of owe her for not siding with Dawlish, and it didn't hurt to have muckraking journalists pretend to like you instead of hate you. That's a nice suit. Harry, can I call you Harry? Are you taking the youngest Miss Grimblehawk out on another date, Harry? I heard about your birthday luncheon. Seems serious. Is this for the prophet or teen witch? I asked. After mentioning my previous run-in with Rita to Mathilda, we'd worked out what she was okay with me telling the reporter if I ran into her again. Let's just see where the story takes us, shall we? She suggested, setting up her poison green dictaquill and parchment. I'd found out that it was a quick quotes quill, which a lot of people were suspicious of since it tended to elaborate and editorialize on the fly, rather than being a simple record of speech like normal dictaquills. But given that Rita was just going to rewrite the interview in her own style anyway, I didn't see that it was scandalous to let her skip a step to get to press faster. Fair enough. Yes, I've been dating Mathilda Grimblehawk for over a year now, and we were friends for several months before that. She's a year behind me, also in Gryffindor. Serious. I had dinner with her family the other night, I allowed. Oh, very nice. Congratulations. Other than the slight scandal of Mr. Grimblehawk's divorce and remarriage to a much younger witch, they're a fine family. So sad that she can't have the same experience meeting your family, she said, abruptly switching topics. Is it true that your mother was a Death Eater? Ah, right to the stuff I would rather not talk about. I tried to deflect a little and suggested, the last time I confronted Voldemort, there was the twitch I was getting so fond of seeing from the fearful locals. He seemed to think he had some kind of control over her, at least enough that he was mad that she kept doing the opposite of what he wanted. She did marry a muggle, my father, so may have just felt trapped until she could get out. I hear there was a lot of that going around. Paralyzed for a second deciding which of those topics to follow up on, Rita seemed to go with her gut and look for interpersonal drama rather than arguably defeated Dark Lords. Tell me about your father. I nodded, feeling a little safer about the subject. Malcolm Dresden was a muggle magician. You know, they use mechanical devices and sleight of hand to make it look like they're doing magic to entertain audiences. I remember him being a very kind man, but he unfortunately died suddenly when I was 5. I know he had loved my mother very much, and I think she must have loved him back. And how did your grandmother feel about her daughter leaving Hogwarts early, disappearing into you-know-whose camp, and then eventually marrying a muggle and continuing the family half-blood tradition? I honestly had no idea. No one seemed to want to tell me anything about my mother's family. No clue, I shrugged. Surely you've talked to her about it. How would I have talked to her about it? I asked, then probably made a mistake of revealing. I don't actually know who my mother's parents were. Rita's eyes got wide behind her spectacles, and her mouth set in a very predatory smile before she said, well then, readers, perhaps it is time to talk about some background information I've learned to edify both Harry and interested former Hogwarts students. Margaret McGregor was the daughter of a muggle man named Dougal McGregor, who grew up in a small village in Scotland called Caithness. While it was a muggle town, a half-blood family lived on the outskirts, and young Dougal met and fell in love with a young witch, just graduated from Hogwarts and about to start on her career. She was perhaps less than diligent with her anti-pregnancy potions, and her career in the ministry was complicated by having a young daughter. I couldn't find out if Dougal ever even realized that he was a father. He later married a muggle woman, had a family, and they died in the war. Some wondered if, perhaps, it was Margaret McGregor trying to purge her Muggle heritage to gain favor with her Dark Lord. I must have looked angry, because she amended. But as you say, if she was truly egalitarian enough to marry a Muggle of her own, perhaps it was unrelated, or perhaps you know who trying to punish her for disobedience. Caithness, you said. I asked, reeling from learning about my grandfather, only to immediately hear that he and his family had been murdered by Death Eaters. Something about that village name seemed familiar. Indeed, it seems that, as appears to be the way of the witches in the family, Isabel Ross, of the Inverness Rosses, fell in love with a Muggle man to the great shame of her wizarding family. She may not have even told the man, a minister in the Muggle church, that she was a witch until their daughter received her Hogwarts letter. But, in fact, the witch who would go on to eventually end her ministry career due to the difficulty of being a single mother will be familiar to many of our readers, because she went on to teach at Hogwarts. Her name, of course, is Minerva McGonagall. Rita may have been disappointed that I couldn't give a response, as shocked as I was. I heard the dictaquil still scratching away, so perhaps she was willing it to describe my discomfiture. It all made sense. Why hadn't she told me? I wanted to run back up to the castle and confront her. I wanted to go hide in my room at the inn. I wanted someone to explain to me why I'd had family after all, right with me for over 2 years, and no one had ever said anything. I'm sorry. I didn't know, I managed to say. Can we pick this up later? Of course, Harry. I look forward to hearing more once you've had a chance to check my facts, she smiled, obvious trying to be soothing, but looking much more like a shark that had scented blood. Perhaps your next Hogsmeade weekend. I think I agreed. I think I went and hid in my room at the inn for a while. The next hour or so was a bit of a blur. Apparently, I decided to go to the ball after all. I spaced on the Malfoy receiving line and barely realized where I was until I found myself in a small private room sitting across from Bellatrix Lestrange. Harry, are you okay? She asked, the look on her face less concern and more like a car owner wondering why an unexpected light came on in the dashboard. Interestingly, she wasn't polyjuiced this year, looking like herself in a very nice dark blue dress. Don't you need a disguise? I asked. This year I need to have a few meetings as myself. Hopefully no one will know I'm here who isn't supposed to, she shrugged, but the implicit command to my gesh was felt. So what's bothering you? Just found out who my grandmother is, I admitted. Suddenly, a look that was more human than I'd ever seen crossed her face, a strangely protective, righteous rage. That old bitch, she never told you. Of course she wouldn't. Can't show favoritism. Can't be a damned mother to her daughter, except when she disapproves. I thought, since you were in her house, unlike Margaret, maybe it would be easier. Maybe she'd realize the mistakes she made, or at least be proud you turned out a lion instead of a serpent like her daughter. Madness in her eyes calmed somewhat, and she regarded me almost like the godmother she was meant to have been, tentatively patting my hand like she'd never had to console another living being before and didn't know how it worked. I'm sorry, Harry. That woman drove Margaret further and further away. I didn't realize she'd do the same to you. I nodded, pulling myself together. The sheer ridiculousness of being consoled by my mad fairy godmother allowed me to compartmentalize and push it off for later. This wasn't the place to have a breakdown, and I still needed to make sure Mathilda wasn't alone here. Almost on cue, there was a knock at the door to announce one of the secret conspiratorial meetings that I wasn't allowed to talk about. The young man that slipped in had curly black hair and impossibly pale skin. Fairly tall and slim, he seemed to be carved of porcelain by a master craftsman to be perfectly symmetrical and handsome. My first thought was she, but he felt different somehow. Apologies for interrupting, he said in an American accent, but didn't actually seem sorry, and apologies that my father or sisters couldn't make it. Ah, yes, my godmother said, some strange humor entering her eyes as she took him in. We didn't actually expect your father to make the trip, though it's pleasing that he sent an envoy. This is my godson, Harry Dresden, she introduced me, surprising me that she'd named the relationship. And this is one of the very distant Malfoy cousins, whose family we've had dealings with in the past. I'm sorry, dear, I don't recall your name. He held out a hand to me, and I shook, wondering what backroom politics I was getting involved with. He had a firm grip, though his hand was cold, and he was regarding me with almost the same humor that my godmother was, somehow recognizing me. Pleased to meet you, Dresden. I'm Thomas Wraith. Chapter 37, Hexcon 9, House Guest. Chapter text hardball. I was quickly glad-handed out the door and into the ballroom so my godmother could get down to whatever terrifying politicking she was up to. The Thomas guy reminded me that I still hadn't followed up on the Malfoy cousins thing, which Mavra had also mentioned. Harry, Mathilda said, catching me as I walked in the door to the ballroom. She was wearing a little black dress with red accents and gold jewelry that momentarily made me forget all my other problems. One of the worst parts of school robes was that they left so little opportunity to appreciate how much growing up my girlfriend had been doing over the last year or two. You look nice, she said, taking in my own formal clothes with a bit of a leer, so I guess she felt the same way. They said you beat me here. One of my teachers was here, having a private meeting, I explained. I think there might be a lot of guests tonight that are here for that kind of thing. She got it and did the mental calculation of what auras were in the room. The Longbottoms hadn't made it this year, so they were few on the ground, especially ones we knew were allies. She actually helped a bit, though, I shrugged, taking her arm and pulling her over to a side of the enormous ballroom covered in winter-themed decorations that didn't seem to be immediately covered in eavesdroppers. Rita cornered me for an interview and asked me about my grandmother, who's Professor McGonagall. I wasn't really doing okay. Oh, and she's never told you. Why? I don't know. Apparently she really screwed up with my mom. Seems like cowardly is the wrong choice for the head of Gryffindor, but I can't think of a better reason. I'm just hoping I can just try to have a nice time and figure out what to do about it later. You look amazing, by the way. She smiled, doing a little twirl so I could see the whole dress. So, dancing. Let's, I said, escorting Mathilda to the dance floor. We made it through 2 songs before the first problem presented itself. As we moved by a table with the minister, Cornelius Fudge, I noticed that the portly little man was turning on the charm for an extremely thin woman in an aggressively colorful dress that included a wide-brimmed hat with a veil. But the little skin that was visible was a pallid gray, and I couldn't help but hear her grit something at Fudge like a long-term smoker. His reply was much more clear. Oh. Are you perhaps involved in Eldred Wurple's study? I've had the opportunity to read some of his early notes for Blood Brothers, and it's fascinating stuff. I'm afraid not, the woman grated. I spend most of my time on the continent, though I'd be very interested if wizards wanted to spend more time with my family. Perfectly in time with her emphasis, she rotated her head just slightly further than a living human could, and I could make out Mavra's roomy eyes through her veil, giving me a close-lipped smirk. If you'll excuse me, though, Minister, I have a meeting to get to. Mavra, the vampire from Egypt, I whispered to Mathilda. I guessed she hadn't been properly identified, or at least the British ministry not informed, after her attack in Abu Simbel. What is going on, Harry? She asked. This is usually just British socialites. There are a lot of faces I don't recognize, and some I do. That's Mr. Ferro, she said, indicating a distinguished and imposing man whose age I couldn't quite place, holding court with several purebloods while smoking a pipe. He owns more dragon breeding grounds than anyone else on the continent, but he usually hates parties. Dad's been trying to meet him for years. Did you want to go introduce yourself? I asked. Merlin, no. He's supposed to be terrifying. I'd rather he didn't know about me. A few dances later, while we were taking a break near the punch table, we noticed that Mr. Ferro excused himself to leave the room shortly after Mavra returned. They're making alliances right under the minister's nose, I explained, half surprised the Gesh didn't try to stop me. I must have worked enough of it out from non-secrets for it not to count. Can we tell him? Can we tell anyone? Mathilda asked, looking around. He's sitting with Umbridge, who probably isn't my biggest fan after last year, I explained, guiltily. And I'm sure they have everything set up for deniability. It is Malfoy's house. It is, announced Maeve, sneaking up while I was tracking the dragon breeder and Mavra. I glanced over and wasn't surprised to see her in a white and blue gown that was just slightly on the risque side for the rest of the gathering, low cut, showing off too much skin, and high skirt displaying long socks with Captain Planet characters on them. And someone didn't read his invitation, she taunted. I didn't immediately try to pull out the invitation and figure out what she was talking about, so she huffed and explained. No +1 this year, Harry. You must have taken that for granted. If your girlfriend isn't here on someone else's invitation, then she's crashing. What's your point? Mathilda asked. The Welsh language insult was left off but implied. Just that none of our guests would be breaking our hospitality should they get a bit out of hand with you. Hell's bells, Maeve. Can't you let it rest for one night? I asked. She shrugged. We could have been friends, Harry. But since the two of you seem inclined to try to be my enemy, then all's fair. So can Malfoys invite people to the party, or just people imposing on their hospitality full time? I asked, catching Draco's eye and giving him a head tilt that I wanted him to come over. He walked over escorting Pansy Parkinson, his ostensible betrothed, a pug-faced, dark-haired girl from Slytherin who was apparently the mean girl for her year. Well, that description was probably colored by how Hermione and even Millicent described her. She wasn't a traditional beauty by any estimation, but she would look perfectly fine if she didn't constantly look down her admittedly small nose at people. I figured Draco was looking for any distraction. "Can I be of service?" he asked. "My invitation seems to have accidentally left off the +1, I told him, actually checking the card in my pocket. Not that Maeve could lie. "We were hoping you could tell Maeve here that Mathilda is welcome." "You will not," Maeve instructed the kid, who she'd driven out of his own house all summer. Draco gave me a long-suffering look that I'd pulled him into my problems, then regarded Maeve with a look that I read as more tired of her shit than he was of his dates. If Ms. Grimblehawk wasn't invited, she should have been turned away at the receiving room, he explained. I'm not sure that it would reflect well on the Malfoy reputation if we allowed people to believe they were guests only to accuse them of trespassing later. And yet, technicalities, Maeve said, smugly, as if she had the upper hand. Yes, but I think there's a technical way to solve the problem, he drawled, giving me a look that was almost as mad as his two aunts. Before anyone could stop him, he announced to the room, if I could have everyone's attention. As the music stopped, and the dancers and rest of the guests turned to regard our little cluster by the refreshments, I hissed, "Draco, what are you? Solving your problems," he whispered back, then announced, "We have a disagreement between my Aunt Maeve and Mathilda of the Grimblehawk family. Both of them are 6th years at Hogwarts. I suggest they solve it in the traditional way and give us all a demonstration of the practical instruction they've been receiving. Honor duel." I heard being whispered through the crowd. Lucius Malfoy strode over, eyes half-lidded, and trying to work out what was going on from Maeve looking like Draco had let the air out of her sails, Mathilda still looking pissed, and me probably looking at Draco like he was crazy. What is the disagreement? Dresden received an invitation with no +1, which he believes is an accidental omission. My dear aunt insists that Grimblehawk is, therefore, party crashing, and does not want a retroactive invitation to be extended, Draco summed up. The older Malfoy got the same look on his face that Draco had on hearing the problem. I wondered if Maeve and Bellatrix were just playing these stupid games of trivial technicalities to be awful all the time. Like, I'm sorry, Draco, it is precisely 8:01 and you were told that breakfast was at 8:00, therefore I have taken all the scones. The head of the house looked to Maeve, and you won't relent. She shook her head. Very well. He turned to the party and announced, clear a space. Darby. To the house elf who popped in, he ordered, bring out the dueling platform and set it up in the middle of the room. The elf bowed his agreement, and soon enough the ballroom floor had a long platform 7 feet wide and 30 long, made of rune-etched 7-inch-high wooden sections. Are you each familiar with the rules? Malfoy asked. Both nodded, and I squeezed Mathilda's hand as she took her end of the platform. We'd had a whispered conversation in the little time it took to set up, and were hoping that Maeve couldn't really show off her true powers without tipping her hand to the ministry. Standard rules for an honor duel: no illegal spells, unconsciousness, leaving the platform, or verbal submission to decide the loser. If Miss Grimblehawk wins, she is confirmed as a guest. If she loses, she will head home. That's quite odd. I realized that Fudge and Umbridge were a few feet away, and he had directed his statement to me. Umbridge was actually wearing something understated for her, which was a dark pink robe-like gown. Maeve got touchy that they forgot to put a +1 on my invitation, I explained, shrugging. HMPH. Hopefully her breeding will out eventually, Umbridge frowned. I suspected that the plump, conservative witch only tolerated Maeve at all because she was ostensibly a Malfoy and would hate her with the power of a million suns if she just met her on the street, proving that there were several areas where my girlfriend's command over magic was way better than mine. Mathilda quickly transfigured her fairly tight skirt into something looser and conjured and put on a simple red tunic to prevent any wardrobe malfunctions from her bodice. For her part, Maeve's skirt was already aggressively slit so she could move in it, and she didn't seem worried about her top. They both took dueling stances. Mathilda favored a simple side-on stance with her wand held up and forward, almost like a fencing starting guard. Maeve leaned forward, a leg back, and her wand held behind her, hidden. "Wards active," Lucius Malfoy announced, gesturing with his wand, and the runes on the platform lit as the air bounding the platform shimmered, containing any spells from hitting the bystanders or room. "Ready, bow." They did very slightly. "Begin." I wasn't surprised that Maeve led off quickly with a glacius to generate a blast of frost. In fact, many of her spells seemed to use ice or blasts of cold wind. All her other spells seemed to be mostly to try to hurt Mathilda rather than hit, and they dissolved oddly at the dueling wards, making me suspect they were glamour that wouldn't do much if they landed. However, some crunched at the edge, probably concealing very real shards of ice. She didn't bother to shield, simply dodging everything and counterspelling jinxes that hit. I suspected she was somewhat magic-resistant, and just choosing to be hit by the weaker spells to pretend to undo them quickly. Meanwhile, Mathilda had stepped up her combat spells. She didn't have my deep well of magical stamina, so she couldn't just throw out her best spells over and over like I could. Instead, she still mixed in a bunch of first-year and second-year jinxes, but broke out stunners and bolts of fire when she had the opportunity. I drilled hard with her over the past few months, so her shields were fast and solid to both objects and magic. I saw Maeve frown the first time she realized her hidden ice darts weren't going to slide through. Overall, it was a fairly even fight. Mathilda had been in multiple fights against magical beasts and dark wizards and had been taking her defense training seriously. She spent a lot of time dodging, shielded when she had to, and lobbed a bunch of pretty colors downrange with decent accuracy. The crowd seemed to enjoy it, probably much more than they'd have liked my own style of turtling behind a powerful shield and throwing out little but stunners or gouts of fire. But if it was even, it was only because Maeve was very constrained by the role she was playing. She was dodging spells just short of preternaturally fast, couldn't use that speed to just run up and take the fight physical, and probably couldn't use most of her magical arsenal because she wouldn't be able to disguise it as wizard magic in front of the crowd. There were a couple of moments where she seemed to get frustrated at that fact and barely held back from doing something inexplicable. And the temperature was dropping even out in the room, and subtle frost patterns were spreading from Maeve's side of the platform. I noticed Mathilda looking a little confused, and I realized that Maeve must be amping up her aura to affect her mind. Well, if she was cheating, I waited for it to look like Mathilda was mostly out of it, and Maeve was winding up a big hit, clenched my hand around my magic ring, and whispered, "Libero." The flashlight spell was nice, the secret messages were cool, but the real selling point of the rings I'd made was that the wearers could cast soulfire spells on each other through them. Voldemort and his Jolly Band were way too free with the Imperious and Possession, and it was nice to be able to clear that without even having to land a spell at range. And because it used Protean charms, it skipped right past the dueling wards through the link. Fortunately, whatever aura Maeve was pouring out was well within the power of the Libertors to clear, and Mathilda suddenly snapped from seemingly drunk to perfectly alert, sidestepped the ultra-cold blast of ice, which might have actually cut her up or given her frostbite, because Maeve was the worst, and yelled, "Flypendo." Already assuming she was the winner, Maeve couldn't quite dodge the knockback jinx. I actually noticed a moment of hesitation before she flung herself off the platform, as if she took a moment to realize that everyone would notice if she just no-sold the spell with no explanation. I hated magic-resistant targets so much. I decided if I ever had to fight Maeve for real, and it seemed more and more likely every day, I wasn't going to mess around with spells. I was coming with iron. An excellent showing from both of our young witches. the senior Malfoy announced. Clearly, our Newt examiners have a lot to look forward to next year. Ms. Grimblehawk, thank you for being a guest of the Malfoy household and putting on such an excellent demonstration. Thank you as well to my half-sister Maeve for her own demonstration of dueling skills. There was a great deal of applause as Mathilda stepped down and leaned against me exhausted and freezing, but still brimming with the confidence of the Libertors, or maybe just her own irrepressibility. Who's next? That vampire is not here. I'll fight 'em all. You did great, baby, I told her. But maybe punch and something to eat before your next fight. Oh, yeah, that sounds nice. She leaned against me, grinning. Right in her pretty garb, I said I would. She just shook her head and looked across the room at Maeve, who was creating a little patch of frost on the floor, staring daggers at us. Balmy ferret. Near dark, with Maeve's gambit disrupted, the rest of the party went pretty well. The only other weird moment was the guy I'd met briefly before his conversation with my godmother, meeting me at the refreshments table. You armed? He asked, conspiratorially over punch. I narrowed my eyes, and he shot a glance over to the table where I'd seen Mavra earlier. I don't think she's done with you yet. Watch your back. Before I could respond to that, he'd walked off as if we'd never talked. Other than that odd little warning, there weren't any more interruptions to our dancing. We shared a lovely midnight kiss, and I was walking Mathilda back to the flue as the party was ending when my godmother beckoned us into her little conspiratorial antechamber. Perhaps a little more willing to go along with it because of the glasses of champagne. My girlfriend shot me a confused look, but didn't object as we headed in. Mrs. Lestrain, she greeted politely, one of the biggest bogey women of wizarding Britain. I suppose so, my godmother mused. Not that I've seen Rodolphus in some time. She started stalking around us, observing Mathilda with a stance somewhere between a dressmaker fitting a gown and a tiger trying to pounce from behind. Good speed. You're hamstrung a little on energy throughput. You should consider conjuring spikes to add some variety. Ditch the first-year jinxes. They won't even slow serious opponents down. Shield seemed solid, glad that Harry's taught you to make a physical one. Some tutoring with the old man's aura friends, too, I imagine. I take it you watched the duel? I asked her. Of course. Draco's idea. I'm glad you've been giving him so much effort. He really needed more perspective than he'd have gotten simply from Slytherin House. If you can just kill off Cousin Ciri, he'll stand to inherit the Black Seat, so needs to be competent. You want Sirius Black dead? Mathilda asked. He's your cousin, and worked with you to support you-know-who. Bellatrix waved her hand in dismissal as if swatting away gnats. He was the worst Black in some time. He certainly never supported the Dark Lord. I don't know what he's up to now. Probably crazy. Ha, I said, then explained. He has a shard of Voldemort's soul possessing him. I hadn't totally explained the Horcrux thing to Mathilda, but she had the gist of it. That actually stopped the madwoman for a moment, and she paused, considering. Well, then it's doubly important that you kill him soon. She took in both of our looks of surprise and said, What? I don't want the Dark Lord back any more than you do. He killed Margaret with an entropy curse out of pique. Probably your father, too. She was my friend, and he set our plans back years. You thought Severus alone was enough to do the job. Who do you think checked his potions and didn't report that they were explosives? We had wondered why you hadn't been involved the last 3 years, I admitted, after taking a beat to internalize that Voldemort killed my parents. It certainly fit. I guess I could be doing more, she shrugged. But you keep handling it. He does keep putting Draco in danger. I'll look into it. Physically barbed, cocking her head to try to shake herself back off the tangent. Anyway, good showing, Miss Grimblehawk. I never supported Maeve's crusade against you, but well, there's only so much you can say to the boss daughter. You and Harry should try to stay out of her way. She can hold a grudge forever. Looking at me with her mad eyes, she tapped the side of her head and explained carefully, She's not all there, I'm afraid. I barely managed to stifle my guffaw and choked out, Thanks for the advice. Now, you may not have noticed, but I haven't been around these past few months, and I won't be around much the rest of the year either. Other people to teach besides you. Watch your back. Watch each other's backs, I guess. I'd say stop annoying my benefactors, but then you just do it twice as hard. Maybe I should tell you that you should annoy them. Hard-headed boy. I'm forgetting something. She ran a hand through her flyaway mass of black curls before lighting up like she'd remembered and retrieving an old magical camera from a cabinet in the room. "Bunch up, smile," she said, snapping away like she was getting a prom photo. "You're so cute together. I approve." Suddenly, she was inches from Mathilda's face. "Break my godson's heart, and I'll rip yours out with my bare hands." The smile never left her face when she said it, and she patted Mathilda on the shoulder. "Good night." As we walked down the hallway to the den, Mathilda was only shaking a little bit. Finally, she explained, "Overall, not as bad as my family dinner, huh? I'm not sure what to do with any of that, least of which is that she seems to like you," I told her. "But if you get any mysterious gifts you need to let me know. You don't want to go into debt with her." "Right, don't get under that lady's thumb. Understood," she said. Still, those two aside, I had a nice night. She gave me another long kiss goodbye. "Night, Harry. See you on Monday. Get home safe." And she went home through the flu. I, of course, immediately failed at that simple mission. Moments before I should have exited the flue into the Three Broomsticks common room, I felt a sudden jerk in my passage, and I found myself shooting out into the frigid night air. I barely managed to still land on my feet, spinning and seeing that I'd come out of a campfire beneath a hastily erected, rune-etched wooden archway. Between the light of the fire and the moon that had been full only a couple of nights earlier, both the terrain and immediate environment looked familiar. I was standing in the burned-out foundation of the Shrieking Shack, which had an incident with FiendFyre, not my fault, the year before. The Fey Woods were to my right, the forbidden forest behind me, the walls of Hogwarts arcing across my left, and Hogsmeade far enough away in front of me to be a problem. Because there were three shadowy figures at the edges of the foundation, blocking my way. "Dresden," a smoker's voice grated from the middle figure, and I could make out Mavra's colorful dress from the party. "That must have been a hell of a goodbye. We were starting to think you weren't coming." The other two figures weren't as nicely dressed, two vaguely male forms with the same corpse-like look to them as Mavra had. So I was facing three super-fast, super-strong vampires. They'd obviously managed a redirect on the flu. Mavra could probably put up an anti-apparition jinx, or my attempt to teleport away would just be redirected to the same spot. They almost certainly didn't pull me out here to talk. I had to admit, I was pretty scared, and already thinking about FiendFyre based on the environment. "Pyro incendio," I yelled, rather than bantering, snapping my blasting rod free of my belt from underneath my jacket and taking aim. Wraith's warning had gone a good ways to making sure I had it ready to draw and was keyed up enough to start out very aggressively. Mavra was already moving, but the vampire to my right must have thought I was unarmed. The purple jet of flame almost instantly resolved into a large cat imago that pounced on the guy. He didn't even have time to scream. Look, I'm not proud of it, but I've been doing the research for over 2 years. Unlike the true Unforgivables, since FiendFyre was doing the most simple and obvious thing possible with Hellfire, it wasn't automatically damaging to your soul, but only if it killed someone. Vampires didn't count as someone, as far as killing with magic went. And I was reasonably certain that the scrub grasses in the area weren't going to give the fire enough fuel to make it to the forests or Hogsmeade, even if they hadn't been covered in frost. After all, it had only taken out Justin's entire house the last time I'd used it, rather than the neighbors. See, I'm a responsible user of hellish flame. The hard part was cutting off my connection to the fire before it drained my available magic. I swung the super-hot flamethrower across the foundation while I clamped down, and managed to get the torrent of flame to go out without sacrificing another blasting rod. Hoping the Hellfire Imago would keep them distracted for a minute before it used up whatever power it had gotten from consuming the vampire, I turned and bolted. It got me a really good head start. Unfortunately, vampires are obnoxiously fast. Something that hit like a small car smashed me in the back before I'd gone even a third of the way back to Hogsmeade. I was moving away as fast as I could, so that seemed to turn some of the energy into throwing me across the heath instead of actually breaking my spine in half. Fortunately, I was getting a lot of practice aiming while getting knocked to the ground. I grunted out a regular incendio as I hit the frozen ground, focusing on a big gout of flame rather than a focused line, and managed to catch the second vampire henchman with the edge. He went up well, like a desiccated corpse, and started wailing and throwing himself on the ground to try to put out the fire. I thought about a follow-up spell to try to finish him off, but I realized I'd lost track of Mavra. I threw up a shield and was rewarded for my forethought by some nasty dark spell cracking off of it a moment later. I was once again glad that Hellfire spells didn't seem to work if you didn't actually have a soul to tear up with them, because a vampire throwing unforgivables would really, well, suck. Okay, with her henchman still trying to put himself out, I was down to one vampire, ah ha ha. One was manageable. Sure, she was a super fast dark witch, but that just meant she was more likely to hang back and lob spells at me before deciding to just rip my head off. I managed to get my feet under me despite my aching back and started hustling toward town as fast as I could go while still holding up a shield and trying to keep an eye on where the spells were coming from. I was so focused on where the zippy vampire spellcaster was on the rolling, moonlit heath that I missed another threat. Bounding from the edge of the Fey Wood, I was flanked by a large black dog with glowing red eyes, who managed to grab a mouthful of my leg and yank my foot out from under me, once again slamming me on the ground. "Oh, come on, Confringo," I yelled, forcing the dog to let go and dodge rather than eat a blasting curse at point-blank range. With my luck, the Dementors would probably tag in on me in a second too. As I scuttled back, favoring my dog-bitten leg, I tossed in a bombarder. For good measure, aiming at the ground, kicking up a blast of frozen, rocky soil into the animagus face, and hopefully creating a screen of dirt against Mavra for a moment. Between the two fast-moving enemies, maybe three, since the henchman was no longer screaming about being on fire, there was no way I was making it to Hogsmeade over the clear, rolling terrain, especially since nobody seemed to have wandered out to help with a fight at 2 in the morning. But I'd gotten herded right up against the edge of the Fey Woods, and my godmother had just told me she wasn't coordinating with Voldemort's forces. Managing to roll to my feet and narrowly avoid another salvo from Mavra, I pushed myself to dash into the tree line, back and leg in agony, even through the adrenaline. A few more spells slammed against the trees around me as I dodged between trunks, and I could hear branches crashing from my right as the extinguished henchman tried to catch up to me. Maybe he'd stake himself. To my left, I heard a canine grunting as Black tried to outflank me. Within moments, I'd be caught in between three opponents, and they could corner me and tear me apart at their leisure. But I knew something they didn't know. Using the last of my physical strength to bound onto the low, unusually circular hill in the clearing before me, I started to turn and could make out all three of my pursuers in a perfect triangle. The vampires even seemed to be grinning smugly at how trapped I'd gotten. But I was really hoping that the Wrath, designed since before the Veil for long-distance travel, wasn't subject to whatever interdiction Mavra had set up. I kept turning and used the last of my magical strength to concentrate on my deliberation, determination, destination, far away from here. I risked splinching a finger off by shooting Mavra the bird as I disapparated. House guest in theory, now that I'd finally started using the Wraths again after 2 years of avoidance, I had the whole of the British Isles to choose from. My godmother had given me an annotated road atlas and everything. In practice, I hadn't really committed any of those spots to memory, because I didn't intend to do what she wanted and shake loose any more never-never monsters to maraud across the countryside. I was kind of hoping, a little, that something nasty had popped out on top of the vampires and possessed animagus. So since I was such a poor student of interdimensional geography, I basically remembered that there was the Wrath in the park in West London that I'd accidentally landed in the first time I'd used these, and that there had been a Wrath really close to Hermione's house that I should have used to get home that time. When you have a split second to figure out where to go, sometimes your friend's house seems like a pretty safe option. And that's how a pajamas-wearing Jean Granger, cricket bat in hand, found me on his doorstep at nearly 3 in the morning on the first day of 1994. My brand-new tuxedo was all torn up, and it had taken me the better part of an hour to limp the half-mile to their door. "Sorry, got attacked by vampires. Didn't mean to wake you," I apologized, a little out of it. I vaguely remembered being let in, shown to a bed, and collapsing into sleep. I came to some time later to a surge of guilt followed by a blast of confidence. "Oh, yeah, I guess that would wake you up. Penny apologized from the foot of the Granger guest room bed I was sprawled on. I hit you with the excoriatus and the libeters just in case they infected you with something, but I think you're clear. Did Black bite you on the leg? We probably need to get Madame Pomfrey to give you the magical equivalent of a tetanus shot. The Grangers bandaged it up and I healed it the best I could. Thanks, I told her. Hermione called you. You didn't have to drive all the way down here. No, I apparated to the public flue and then took that most of the way. Can't quite apparate all the way from the leaky cauldron to here without going off course, so I had to do some walking. How did you make it all the way here? Made it to the Rath next to Hogsmeade, I explained. I should have gone somewhere closer, but this was the one that came to me in the crisis. What happened? She asked. I explained the basics of the previous night, Mavra being at the party, and everything that happened after I entered the fireplace at the Malfoys. Only you, Harry, she shook her head. McGonagall's not going to let you out of the castle for the rest of the year. I groaned. I'd managed to forget that issue. What? She's my grandmother, apparently. Nobody wanted to tell me except Rita Skeeter. Ha, she said, thinking about it. That makes the blatant favoritism make more sense. I must have scoffed, because she pointed out, strict disciplinarian Minerva McGonagall lets you get away with all the skiving you did our owl year, constantly backs you up to the headmaster, probably awards you more points than anyone else in her house, and doesn't she buy you Christmas presents? Still would have preferred to know I had family, I grumbled. Penny sat down on the edge of the bed and said, How old is she? I know we act like she's ancient, but she barely seems old enough to be a grandmother of someone who's 18. According to Rita, she had my mom right after Hogwarts. There was a local boy. They forgot to use protection. Next thing you know, she has to become a teacher because that's easier as a single mother than working at the ministry. Oh, yeah, Penny winced. Gosh. I can only imagine how much it would derail my life if Percy and I had a kid soon, and he'd stick around, and we would be able to get the rest of his and my family's to help. Maybe don't take it too personally. She could be terrified you'll reject her. That was definitely a more generous perspective than my godmother's long-maintained hatred of her best friend's distant mother. Before I'd had time to think too hard about it, a giant ginger ball of fluff leaped on top of my chest from the doorway of the guest room. Oof, hi Crookshanks, I told the cat, who accepted a few scritches before walking down to inspect my leg, head-butting my foot in apparent approval of Penny's healing job. Harry, you're up, Hermione yelled, padding down the hall just behind her familiar. Dad said vampires attacked you. Unfortunately. Let's just say that I guess I need to stop taking the flu for granted as a safe point-to-point travel method. They managed to dump me out over in the ruins of the Shrieking Shack instead of the 3 broomsticks. She gasped. I read about that kind of thing. It's one of the reasons for the Hogwarts Express. That type of attack used to be a lot more common after they invented the flu system. I wonder if the Shrieking Shack ever had a fireplace that was connected. They might have been able to reactivate the connection and trick the network. Great, I said. At least the fairies apparently aren't working with Voldemort, so maybe they won't also know that trick. But Mavra was. My Gesh cut me off from finishing the thought. I wondered what the extent of her double-dipping was with her dealings with both Death Eaters and the Fae. Yeah, I guess I could apparate back just in case. I don't know, Harry, Penny objected. It's lucky you didn't splint yourself as it was, and I don't know how to test for magical exhaustion. Maybe you should just take the train back with us tomorrow. It's bad enough that I imposed already. I can't for another night, I told her. Nonsense, Helen Granger walked in, putting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. You're more than welcome to stay another night, Harry. I just wish we had some way of telling the school where you are. They must be worried sick. Ready handled, Dr. Granger, Penny explained, holding up her hand with the ring I'd made. I messaged Mathilda, and she sent an owl to the school. Also, she sent back, he had one mission, and I don't know what that's about. She told me to get home safe. I winced. I realized I was probably going to get an earful about somehow managing to get into another fight with no backup. Trouble does seem to find you, Helen nodded. Professor McGonagall must be constantly worried about you. I winced. Penny told her, sore subject. What? Hermione asked. I guessed it was going to be in the paper or Teen Witch Weekly soon enough, so I explained. Rita Skeeter found out that McGonagall's my grandmother. I don't know why she never told me. Ha! Hermione laughed in vindication. I knew she was too nice to you for some reason. She doesn't let anyone else in Gryffindor get away with nearly as much as you do. That's what I told him, Penny agreed. I kind of felt like it was Pickhorn Harry's obliviousness day. Hermione's mom said, Jean almost has lunch ready. Why don't you girls head down, and we'll be down in a minute. After they'd nodded and left, the dark-haired dentist leaned against the doorjamb and asked, Is she your only family? As far as I know, I told her. I guess my dad might have had relatives that the orphanage never managed to track down. But for 2 years, nobody's been willing to tell me about my mom's people. And then you found out that you had one right there who wouldn't tell you, she nodded. With everything else you're going through, that's a lot. Don't let the girls convince you that it should have been obvious. They've only ever had a whole family. We worked hard at it for Hermione. I lost my mother young, too, and none of her family really had much to do with me after she passed. But maybe just think of whether you feel like she didn't want you to know or just didn't know how to tell you. The adults that look like they have it all together are often the ones that have the hardest time figuring out how to fix it when they do mess up. I guess it's good that I'm getting so much experience fixing my mistakes, and nobody would think that I have it all together, I joked. You don't even see it, she gave me a motherly smile. I know Hermione idolizes you, Harry, probably her friends too. No rational adult thinks they look like they have it all together. Being a grown-up is just one crisis after another that you're not ready for. But I mean, just last night. If I'd been attacked by vampires, I certainly wouldn't have escaped with nothing worse than a dog bite and be joking about it a few hours later. You have it together more than you think. Thanks, ma'am, I told her, though I wasn't sure I was sold. We headed down to lunch, me only hobbling slightly. Penny did good work. Hopefully, the Department of Mysteries would let her work on improving healing spells on the side. As we sat down to a nice New Year's Day lunch of dentist-approved dishes, I thought Jean Granger was going to give me a third grilling on the evening, but he'd apparently heard enough second-hand and instead asked, So another date with Mathilda, huh, Harry? I hear that's getting serious. Hermione's father was a big fan of my current relationship, since it was proof that my intentions toward his daughter were entirely big brotherly. They have the same patroness, Hermione gushed, and get dressed up and go to New Year's balls together. The highly practical witch was probably about to hit the age where she was also annoyed that Hogwarts didn't have fancy dances. And Harry met her parents on Boxing Day, Penny grinned, scooping over a mound of potatoes. Didn't Percy spend it with yours, too? I winked back. And I hear his parrot patroness is starting to look a lot like your eagle. It's an augury, not a parrot, she corrected, but then gave a small smile. But yeah, they were similar enough birds to start with that it's hard to be sure, but I think so. Jean and Helen shared a look that was part enthusiasm about the young love, but part finishing some conversation. Helen decided to point out, in the Muggle world, you both have university to think about it, but magicals basically make you go full adult as soon as you finish school. Have either of you given consideration to what your living situation is going to be with your significant others in a few months? Both Penny's and my eyes widened. Graduation was coming up a lot sooner than either of us really liked to think about. Mathilda will be in school again next year, I hedged, but she'll be 17. And want to stay with you over vacations, Helen pushed. And last summer, I heard Marley talking about planning to make you up a room at the Burrow, Penny, Jean grinned. Both Penny and I groaned, basically simultaneously, and I summed up our issue. We gotta figure out how to get an apartment. Family matter the rest of the day spent with the Grangers was strangely relaxing. While I loved the Weasleys, they were a lot. The doctors Granger were much more relaxed, parental, without being aggressive about it. And they had a TV, a VCR, and tapes of several of the movies I'd missed over the last few years. Of course, I had to sit on the opposite side of the room and keep my magic contained so I wouldn't burn the electronics out. Hermione's power leakage wasn't nearly as bad as mine, but even she had also been exiled to the furthest couch. Apparently the last two TVS had failed dramatically when she forgot and tried to watch up close. Tonks showed up that evening to take my statement. She was nice enough to bring the change of clothes I'd left in my room at the 3 broomsticks that I hadn't been able to use the previous night. Her hair subtly flickering from light to dark pink with what I assumed was amusement as I finished explaining my story. She just shook her head and said, I think Moody's going to ask you to marry him or something." "What?" I boggled. "We walked the crime scene earlier and could corroborate a lot of what you just told me," she explained. "The old man was impressed. You got ambushed in the open by 3 vampires, one of whom is a dark witch and black, got away and managed to take one of them out and wound another. He was just chuckling and saying, 'Ha, constant vigilance,' every time we worked out a different stage of what had happened. And the way I took out that vampire. You probably shouldn't make FiendFyre your go-to or anything, but Moody says he might have tried the same thing in that situation. If you burned down Hogsmeade, it would have been a problem," she grinned. "Well, unless you just got the hog's head." Mavra was at the Malfoy party, talking to the minister. He didn't seem to know who she was, I remembered. "Egypt and Gringotts are both really bad about sharing information," Tonks admitted. "But now she's committed a crime here." "Well, honestly," she shrugged, "if she just tried to kill you, who knows whether the ministry would care, but they take tampering with the flu seriously, and I think we can sell that she's helping Black. Shouldn't you be much deeper into your career before you get that cynical?" I shook my head. I knew more or less what I was getting into, and Moody had no interest in leaving any of my illusions intact. She sighed, her hair fading to a much darker pink. "But if the good auras give up on justice, then that just lets the corrupt ones stay in charge of everything. By the way," she changed the subject, "was my aunt at the Malfoy party this year?" "Ask Mathilda," I confirmed, as much as I was able. She nodded, figured. I was glad that the revelation of my relationship with her insane aunt hadn't ruined my friendship with Tonks. She was good people. Speaking of Mathilda, she didn't actually decide to murder me for nearly getting killed when we met up on the train the next day, but she was pretty upset once I finished explaining what happened. "Harry, why does this keep happening to you? You got jumped in the flu." The rest of my friends' reactions were pretty similar, as I told the story multiple times on the train ride back to Hogwarts. Even Ron, Seamus, and Colin, though they clearly thought it was an exciting story, seemed to realize how much danger I'd been in. I could tell because their usual reckless Gryffindor rambunctiousness was very muted. They didn't even say "wicked," even once. And then, after a few hours' peace on the train, I got called up to Dumbledore's office to tell the story again. McGonagall had sat in on the recounting, and it had been tense. I guess she'd picked up on it, and as she walked me back to Gryffindor after hours, she asked, "What's up, Hoss?" After a brief inclination to play it off, I decided why not do it then. I wasn't going to get less anxious about the conversation over time. "Rita Skeeter ambushed me with family history before the party," I led in. "Wanted to know if I'd talked to my grandmother about my parents, since she was so available to me." Her step hitched and she quietly huffed, "Damn that woman," before visibly steeling herself and asking, "My office?" "Sure," I shrugged. No sense having this out in the relative public of the mostly empty halls, though I guess I would have welcomed Filch and Mrs. Norris showing up to provide emotional support. We detoured to her office, and she offered the guest chair before slumping down at her desk. She glanced consideringly down at a desk drawer, and I assumed there was liquor in there, before she shook her head slightly on the realization that it was a school night. Instead, she folded her hands together and placed them on the surface of the desk, beginning, "I've been trying to find the right time to tell you for over 2 years. Ma'am, with all respect. The right time was the first time we met in the infirmary," I chided her. I was suddenly struck by the memory of Madame Pomfrey sadly regarding the two of us. She must have known the whole time. Probably the whole staff knew, or at least every one of them that had been teaching when my mother was a student. "I know, I'm sorry, Harry," she finally got out. "You deserved better. I should be better. Gryffindor courage is no match for fears about family." "Why were you afraid?" I asked. I needed to know. I didn't buy that it was just a courage issue. "With your mother, with Margaret. I never managed to balance my role as a teacher with my role as a mother. I felt that I couldn't show her preferential treatment, and I wound up pushing her away. I thought that if you knew that I was your grandmother but you still had to treat me as your professor, it would have the same effect." I thought about that for a second, then got out. "Again, with all respect, I think that's bullshit." That cracked a look of shock through her stoic facade. Plenty of kids have their parents as teachers. Any teacher at a public school that's ever had a kid, homeschooled families, Everyone in history that ever taught their kids to do the family business. She just nodded, thinking about it, admitting it seemed to make sense. That's when I began to notice the problem. How did you take her getting sorted into Slytherin? Not well. And before that, I wondered. I had enough of the pieces now that I could put them together to make a shape. You live in the castle with her, or did you move here after she left? Did you have any time for her before she got to Hogwarts? Did she know that you had to give up your original career to take care of her? Maybe what you saw at school was just her finally getting friends to give her context that made her think you didn't love her. All of that was sinking in. I didn't want to make an old woman cry, but it was all coming out. And then I had the thought and ground out. Wait, did you know about me? Did you let me sit in an orphanage for years? No, she insisted. She never told me. I only knew she died from rumors and inability to send her messages. And then one day your name showed up in the book of new students. It includes parents' names for legacy students. I couldn't believe it. But when we got to the orphanage, you were already gone. We searched for you with every moment for a year and had the order on the lookout for clues afterward. That's how Kingsley knew to call us the moment you were arrested. That was the first news we'd had of you in years. Now it was my turn to think. I had never exactly been hiding, but I didn't know the steps Justin had taken to obscure my trail. For all I knew, he could have used some variation of the Fidelius that broke when he died. More likely, even though I hadn't moved far from the orphanage, British wizards would have no idea how to track down a kid in a big city in Muggle America unless I'd made national news. While I was finishing that thought, she got out. I'm still that scared teenager with a baby on the way, inside. Maybe if you come to me after your father died, I would have gotten it right. But there you were, nearly fully grown, coming out of a tragedy greater than most adults have ever suffered, a complete stranger for me to figure out, and I panicked. I put on my educator face and just treated you like any other student until I could figure it out, and I kept putting it off. If that first day at Hogwarts she'd greeted me with how glad she was to have finally found me, that after that nightmare, at least I'd finally been found by family, it might have changed everything. Would have been the right time, I repeated. I'm sorry, Harry, she told me again. I could tell she meant it, but an apology wasn't getting 2.5 years of having a family back. Neither was being hurt and refusing to forgive her, remaining permanently estranged. But I wasn't ready quite yet. I wish I'd heard it from you and not from a reporter, I said. The longer you waited, the less chance there would have ever been a time that made sense. You may have never told me. I need some time. She just nodded sadly as I got up and left. Chapter 38, Hexcon 10, Wild Side. Chapter text chill words. So what exactly are the Unseelie Accords? I finally asked the question that I should have a month earlier. In my defense, I was distracted. But as it finally got to the 21st of January, the Friday on which the Red Cap's slightly vague threat would probably be up, it was clear the ministry wasn't going to sign, and I needed to know what they were refusing. You know, the old laws that you sometimes hear about from conservative types. Bob, my skull-bound spirit of intellect, began. Basically that. It's a huge compendium of things you're not allowed to do and the penalties for doing them. It's mostly international. You know, basically to settle disputes between wizards and vampires and giants and such. It doesn't say a lot about internal rules for, say, wizards. Oh, I see why they don't want to sign then, Mathilda exclaimed. She was still the only person that I'd told about Barb, so the three of us were locked and silenced in a spare classroom. If we learned anything useful, it would get passed on to Dumbledore and his crew. I must have looked more confused, so she went on. There may be a ton of rules in there that are worse than what we've worked out on our own. We've pretty much been on top for centuries. I nodded, thinking I was getting it. Might be harder to keep the other magical races under the ministry, and Iqua's thumb if they suddenly have all these old rights back. Pretty much, Barb agreed. One of the reasons for putting up the veil in the first place was to prevent the Sidhe from enforcing the penalties for reneging on the Accords. It's been downhill for most of the races that used to be on even footing ever since. Seems a lot, though, Mathilda mused. If we had that much power, why not just force renegotiation? Bob considered for a moment and offered. While I don't know for sure what they were thinking, fairy contracts are typically twistier than even demonic ones. Only the she really know everything that's in the accords. Lots of fine print. While the top-line items are easy enough to keep in mind, there are a lot of sub-clauses if you want to get nasty. And the ones they protect most are the she. The wizarding government of the time may have figured it was worth it to take any drastic steps necessary to throw the whole thing out. Got it. Nobody in the government wants to sign it because it gives the evil fairy lawyers too much power, I summed up. How bad would it be if they had to anyway? It worked pretty well for Ian's. Bob rolled his eye flames in what was his equivalent of a sarcastic shrug. Overall, they're pretty fair. Modern thought might consider some of the rules barbaric, or at least archaic. There are a lot of weregild clauses, for example. If you can pay off the family of someone you murdered, that's it for penalties. I wonder if anyone at the ministry even remembers why they broke it in the first place, I mused, since hardly anyone seems to believe in fairies anymore. Do they even have a copy of it to look at and decide they don't want to sign it? Probably in one of the ministry or Iqua libraries, Mathilda answered. Purebloods don't throw away books, and we're as mad for legal precedent as the Muggle government. But this is a long document, I asked. Thousands of pages in a modern book format, Bob agreed. So even if they have a complete copy, it's probably in older languages at this point that not everyone can read. They may have just punted on deciding that they couldn't really get a full understanding of the whole thing in a month, I said. The official line in the paper was about not negotiating with terrorists, which made me laugh because Maeve thought declaring themselves an enemy nation would avoid that label, stationing rapid response teams of hit wizards and improving the wards at key spots. One thing to be said about all the Dark Lords of the 20th century, the wizarding world was pretty comfortable fighting a shadow war against opponents that could attack at any location. If anything, they were probably less concerned about fighting never-never monsters than squads of apparating dark wizards. Muggles had only had about half a century to adjust to the idea of enemies targeting population centers without having to push through a whole army or navy and miles of terrain first. Wizards had been fighting that way forever. It was probably part of why they were so crazy. Speaking of crazy, as soon as Mathilda and I walked back into the Gryffindor common room after the discussion, a frazzled Alexis intercepted me and insisted, "You're a guy, Harry. Tell him he's being insane. Tell them all they're being insane." I clearly felt like she was the insane one with that non sequitur, but Mathilda seemed to know what was going on and asked, "Quidditch practice all weekend." And every evening for the next 2 weeks. He's so obsessed with the Ravenclaw match, I don't even think he's thought about Valentine's Day coming up. Gah! She barely stifled a scream. The younger kids around the room were boggling a little, watching their senior prefect freaking out right in the common room. "I'll try to get him to chill out," I promised. "Guess he's down at the pitch." She rolled her eyes and said, "Of course he is." While Mathilda took my roommate's exasperated girlfriend off to talk and calm down, I headed right back out to talk to said roommate. I hadn't even had a chance to go stow Bob back in my trunk. Sadly, Alexis, potion perfume for holding her boyfriend's attention, wasn't any closer to being finished than my potion for countering cheetah creature speed. And I was hesitant to point out that maybe if they couldn't work things out without chemical assistance. We were about an hour after dinner, so it was full dark outside, especially with the clouds that hung over the castle. It was easy to make out the Quidditch practice across the grounds, as broom-riding silhouettes whipped past the bright lights of the stadium. Fortunately, the clouds were part of a warm front, so it wasn't particularly cold for a Scottish winter, and the temperature control runes I'd worked into my duster were having no problem keeping up with the 40-something temperature. Since I'd gotten the coat for Christmas, I'd basically given up on wearing robes outside of classes, and nobody had said anything. I'd spent most of my enchanting time for the month putting various protective enchantments on the coat, though I could probably still do more. "Harry, come TC practice?" Oliver asked, hopefully, from where he was floating only a little ways off of the ground, coaching the rest of the team on drills. Tonight, it seemed to be bludger evasion. The girls were looping around as the twins swatted the aggressive iron cannonballs at them. "Came to intervene, man," I answered. I had his attention, and he floated down closer to me to talk. "Lexi is pissed you're ignoring her for all this practice. She'll get over it," he waved off. "All our matches got moved to the back half o' the year. I really need tease how what we're made of. It's my last chance at the cup before the professional leagues. You won it last year, though, I argued. True enough, he shrugged. But T was close, and we barely got it on points. Hoppin' T have a real blowout this year. Might not have a girlfriend when you do, though. It looked like I might be getting through with him when there was a sudden cold gust of wind, dropping the temperature to nearly freezing in a moment. Might be time T pack it in anyway. Oliver took the out. Was supposed T be a cold front comin' in. Might be bad weather for flying if it gets windy. And it was. The gust hadn't really let up, and within moments it had turned into a gale. The clouds above were being pushed across the sky, revealing the bright gibbous moon and stars. Seeing Oliver waving them in, the 6 players fought their way down, the force of the wind notably affecting their trajectories. "Sure you don't want to keep going, Ollie?" George asked, somewhat sarcastically. "We could really practice our aerodynamics against gale-force winds," Fred added, helping his brother wrestle the bludgers back into their case. Yeah. If it's like this on game day, you'll be wishing I'd drilled you on it. But Harry was just pointing out that it's the weekend, social lives, and all that. Saved us from a giant snake and Ollie's practices, our hero. Katie grinned, and the rest of the team didn't disagree. "I think I'll shower in the dorms," Angelina mused. "Don't want to walk across the grounds wet with this wind." I hung out while they got their brooms and other gear put away, and the 8 of us started to trudge across the grass back to the castle, the wind pushing against us, so we almost had to lean into it to make progress. I'd find out later that the entire region was getting gales up to 70 miles per hour, and that wasn't even half the freak winter weather that hit the northern Midwestern United States. And then, suddenly, with a roaring of wind, it stopped. While it was still cold, the winds hadn't died down so much as they'd disappeared. The abrupt change made my ears pop like I'd suddenly changed altitudes. Ginny even stumbled a bit, having been leaning hard into the wind that had vanished. "Back to the pitch," Fred joked. But nobody answered because our eyes were glued above, where the stars and moon were suddenly smeared in the sky, as if seen through a rainy window. Well, more like through a frost-covered one. Over only a few seconds, fractal patterns danced across the sky, outlining an invisible dome that had sprung into being. Did someone activate the war wards, maybe? Alicia supposed. Too far out, Oliver disagreed, looking down the edge of the dome. It's got most of the forest and probably Hogsmeade in it, not just the grounds. Guys, that starfield isn't quite right, Angelina, the best at astronomy class, noticed. And I see hints of the northern lights, which weren't supposed to be visible tonight. "Those aren't the northern lights," I disagreed, peering into the darkness, watching the tiny bright forms move and get closer. I could almost make out little gossamer wings on little humanoid figures, and if I was right about what I was seeing, they were carrying little spears. Wrong stars, an army of true Fey pixies incoming, and an interface around the school that was building up frost energy. I hoped I was wrong, but I feared I was right. We just got sucked into the Never Never. Falling stars like hundreds of meteors, the legion of Never Never pixies began to dive toward the 8 of us, tiny stone-chipped spears betraying their intentions in the blue and green glows of their personal lights. A few of them wouldn't be much of a threat to a grown adult, but hundreds could do some damage. Maybe they were just trying to menace us back into the building, and maybe the fortune wards would intervene if their intentions were lethal, but it wasn't worth risking. "Confringo," I shouted, launching a blasting curse to scatter the descending lines. The explosion and shattering of the tiny ferry charge got my fellow students moving. "Fall back," Oliver told the team. It wasn't anywhere near the distance from the shrieking shack to Hogsmeade that I'd tried to cover over New Year's, but we were only midway between the Quidditch pitch and the castle gates. "We should have kept the brooms," groused one of the chasers, probably Alicia, as the team broke into a retreat. "Or at least the bludgers," Ginny added. Above, split by my blast, the attackers were regrouping, spreading out into 2 spreading arms of glowing lights with sharp weapons. It would have been beautiful if it weren't so menacing, a ballet of bright jewels sweeping through the air. We weren't going to beat them in a sprint, and I couldn't hit them all myself. Sweeping my staff in my offhand as I held my blasting rod in my right, I incanted Flipendo. The knockback jinx seemed to work as well on pixies as it did on darksies, blowing another hole in the line as streaks of light were flung into the night. Immobulus, tried Ginny, having heard how the kids had dealt with the Earthside pixies in Lockhart's class the previous year. Shouts of the two spells from the rest of the running Quidditch players began to make more holes in the pattern of lights, alternately being knocked away or dropped paralyzed to the ground. A few managed to dart through anyway, but so far tiny spears weren't enough to easily pierce Quidditch armor. From the corner of my eye, I saw Ginny use her seeker skills to actually grab one rushing attacker out of the air and fling it back away. I felt a couple fail to penetrate the protective enchantments on my coat. "It's a lot, but it's just pixies," Katie suggested, as we covered half the distance and knocked a substantial number of lights out of the air. "Now you've done it," George yelled. Depulso. He tried a banisher, but it wasn't much more effective than the easier knockback charm. "Yep, we're doomed," agreed Fred. "Confundo," he incanted, his wave of confusion sending several tiny lights off in erratic paths. Through the holes in the pixie lines, there was more movement against the foreign stars. Oliver was the first to work it out. "When they're right, they're right. Griffins, I think. Maybe they like to eat pixie," Angelina joked. Some days I was really proud to be in Gryffindor. I bet nobody else's Quidditch team would be able to calmly and jokingly flee from a Fey invasion. The brightly plumaged, fey-raised lion birds did not, in fact, seem to be interested in the pixies. Instead, they plummeted like comets toward us. "Ventus!" I yelled, managing a torrential blast of wind that scattered the remaining pixies and fouled the griffins dive a bit, forcing them to pull up. I couldn't keep that up all night. "Run," I suggested. We'd made it to the main driveway down to the Hogsmeade gates and were close enough to the school now that I thought we might make it. I was half right. 7 athletes who hadn't just let loose a very powerful spell managed to cover the distance, but I fell far enough behind to be an issue. Long legs and a bit of cardio did not equal the grueling sports practice Oliver put them all through, even though most of it was flying rather than running. They probably thought I was right behind them, but I saw my roommate turn in shock as he hit one of the castle doors as 2 griffins landed in between us on the road, cutting me off. "Harry!" he shouted, clearly trying to work out the best way to take out a griffin, who, like most dangerous magical beasts, were already tricky to affect with spells, even without the extra boost they may have from their never-never upbringing. I was worried about the same thing, and cognizant that there were others above me probably waiting for me to be distracted. What I didn't expect was another blur of less brightly colored plumage to drop into my opponents, letting loose a Walkree. Birdhorse tore into Birdlion as one of the hippogriffs, maybe Buckbeak himself, assaulted the Fey monster in a bloody flash of sharp beak and taloned hooves. Above, I heard similar cries as the rest of the hippogriff herd slammed into the still-flying griffins. "Oh, right, hippogriffs are territorial against griffins," Oliver supplied, shouting from the door. I looked up to see if the others had it covered and noticed pixie lights winking out as well. Up above, translucent black horses were mostly visible as they eclipsed the stars. The Thestrals apparently thought pixies were delicious, but the arrival of our own herds of terrifying magical horses reminded me of their caretaker, whose small shack might not hold up to a continued Fey assault. "Get inside," I instructed Oliver, across from the fierce battle that was still in the way of my dash to safety. "I'll check on Hagrid." Clearly upset with me going off on my own again, Oliver rolled his eyes and reminded me, "If you die, Thilda's going to kill you. Good luck." He ducked inside, shutting the heavy front door with finality. It seemed like, for now, the local fauna were coming out ahead in the battle as I ran toward Hagrid's hut across the grounds, essentially opposite the driveway from the Quidditch pitch. I figured we were just seeing the fastest flyers, and I had no idea if we'd soon be drowning in slower-moving fantastical beasts. Nothing else dove at me as I crossed the lawn at a jog, trying to keep from getting so winded I couldn't defend myself if something did come after me. Fang, Hagrid's enormous black boarhound, was barking furiously from the hut as I ran up, and I saw the half-giant's bulk block the light in his window as he looked out to see me coming up. "Harry, what's going on?" he asked me, opening the door and poking his head out. "I think we got sucked into the Never-Never," I huffed, slowing down to his door. I summed up, "Buckbeak's herd and the Thestrals are fighting a bunch of pixies and griffins. We need to get into the castle in case worse shows up." He looked like he was going to argue, but finally nodded and shrugged on his coat and grabbed his gear, including his handheld ballista. He banked his fire and stepped out into the night. "Come on, Fang," he ordered the dog, closing the door behind him. "Wards are supposed to keep hostile beasts out," he groused as we started to head back toward the school. "Probably supposed to do a lot of things that don't work right when we get transported into the Never Never," I shrugged. "Hopefully Dumbledore's up and figuring it out." He made a good point, though. If the creature prevention wards weren't working, the fortune wards might not be either. Not that I took for granted that I was safe from getting killed at school, but it was something else to keep in mind. We could still see an aerial fight above the grounds as we fast-walked across. "I leave. I am alone." Hagrid yelled at a griffin that seemed to be winning his dogfight and let fly with a crossbow quarrel that could probably be used as a siege weapon. The surprised griffin crashed into the turf as a mangled wing was nearly torn off its body by the heavy projectile. "Hate Tito Tha," the giant gamekeeper grimaced, "but can't be having aggressive critters on the grounds." Before he could get another bolt loaded or I could console him about the damage to the extraplanar wildlife, Fang whined at something behind us. I spun to see a patch of greater darkness rolling across the grounds in our direction, seemingly coming out of the forest and engulfing the hut we just left. It at least made me feel good about rescuing Hagrid. Within the writhing shadows, I could make out the grunts of animals sprinting across the lawn. "Hobbs," Hagrid said, slotting the bolt into place. "Think you're right, Harry. None outside our African reserves for ages. Big, nasty demiguises," he explained, "but they make darkness instead o' making themselves invisible." I didn't go to magical creatures class, but if I remembered right from my defense owl study of hostile beasts, the nearly extinct Hobbs darkness was called Miak, and they could basically control it to murder prey in the shadows. And of course, they were magic resistant. Before we could figure out our tactic against a hidden number of assassin baboons, the cloud of darkness and sounds of running stopped. Stepping forth from the unnatural shadows, but still barely visible in the starlight, was an extremely handsome but short and stocky man in black leather armor. The pointed ears and beauty made me guess another she, but not one I'd seen before. "Ah, fortuitous," he announced, bracing an ebon-shafted spear with a sharp obsidian spike as the point. "Lefacen, I presume." Not sure if I wanted to get another pass for whatever my mother and godmother had gotten up to, I nonetheless nodded. "The same." "Excellent. I hear that you've quite upset one of our queens." He smiled menacingly, baring teeth that gleamed white even in the extremely dim light. "I shall be quite happy to be the distributor of her ill will." With that bit of parley out of the way, he stepped back into the darkness, which once again began to charge. So much for my mother's protection. Night terror, Lumos Maxima. I tried, the overpowered lighting charm causing my amulet to flare like a spotlight from my chest. It barely did anything to the Miak surrounding the horde of fey beasts, other than make their silhouettes contrast slightly against the cloud of shadow. It was enough to pick a target, and my follow-up, Bombarda Maxima, heaved an enormous chunk of turf over half the formation. My tendency to blow up the ground to deal with magic-resistant creatures was probably not endearing me to the house elves tasked with landscaping. Hagrid had also used my flash of light for useful targeting, and two screeches seemed to indicate that his heavy quarrel had kept going into the hob behind the one he'd aimed at. Fang, of course, had whimpered and took off like the cowardly dog he was. He honestly had a good plan. "Fall back," I suggested to Hagrid. I saw stars in my vision as I turned and sprinted away from the monsters, hopefully slowed a bit by our attack. Using two powerful spells like that in succession wasn't great for my magical reserves, and hopefully I'd be able to manage a brief sprint without passing out. I could feel Hagrid continuing along right beside me, the ground shaking with his footfalls. I doubted the square cube law would let him do a marathon, but 9 feet of height and an active lifestyle made him surprisingly fast over short distances. He was even managing to reload his crossbow while he ran. I guess if you're going to have one preferred combat method, you get really good at it. See the plan. I huffed at the big guy, gesturing with my staff at our objective and almost tripping with the upset to my already tenuous running balance. I could hear the clamoring of the hobs behind me. "Gonna be real close," Hagrid agreed, backhanding an ape-trailing darkness that leaped on his back. I saw that, and managed to dodge one that tried the same to me, stumbling on the uneven grass and turning my final sprint into a staggering charge. I felt a weight on my back as another tenebrous ape made the leap and had better aim, angrily hooting at me as it plowed me face first into the dirt in preparation of biting or ripping my head off. Hagrid hit the ground rolling at about the same time, more gracefully, dodging a blur of shadow and clawed arms that just missed him, and then got unceremoniously punted through the air in the direction of the castle with a sound like a baseball bat striking a side of beef. The one on my back hooted in surprise before I felt it, also get driven off of me with a golf swing that very nearly missed me. Whomping Willow 2, Hobbs 0. Well, if you counted my mouthful of dirt and grass burn, give them half a point. I could hear several more surprised, pained hoots, and the rapid creaking of wood like an old ship in a dangerous sea as the ornery osier offed our onyx opponents. Look, when you're hunkered down in the dirt while tons of hardwood smash around you, you can alliterate all you want to. And roll, Hagrid suggested, when the sounds of branches narrowly missing us moved on to the other side of the tree's radius of denial. Sheathing my rod and pulling my staff close, I started to try to roll back toward the castle and away from the trunk. Hagrid had simply tossed his crossbow ahead before he began rolling and was pulling ahead of me. He had a lot more girth to work with, so he covered more ground with each rotation. I just cleared the area where the grass barely grew, not even the sod safe from the tree's occasional tantrums, when a massive black spear was barely deflected by my coat and into the ground. If I'd been rolling a little slower, it probably would have hit. Clever, but insufficient, the shadowy she sneered, standing slightly separate, sequestered, safely suspicious. Look, I'm not proud of it, the alliterating, but it's hard to focus when there's a fey-built cheetah weapon that just nearly impaled you. Obsidian shouldn't even be able to get that long without shattering unless you use magic. I did not want to get hit with the spear. Depulso, I said, too scared of the follow-up thrust for a one-liner, my right hand coming up out of my belt pouch that I'd been grabbing for while rolling. I'd planned to use my staff to banish the iron nails at our opponents from a distance, but in melee range, a wandless charm was sufficient. Tiny sparks of bright fire lit up the front of the black-clad she-knight as he screamed in pain and flung himself away from me. He even let go of the spear, and I was able to grab it one-handed where it still stuck in the ground and toss it behind me back into the willow's danger zone. I didn't want to try running with two long shafts of wood. The thrum of Hagrid's crossbow informed me that he'd managed to lever himself back up and had impaled the first harb that had been knocked in our direction, recovering and reforming its shadows. Ways clear. Gamekeeper grunted, glancing my way, and then beginning to trundle toward the castle doors. Somehow we crashed through before I completely exhausted myself. Maybe my light cardio needed to become a real exercise set, all the sprinting I was doing. I slid across the stone of the castle atrium and clocked Oliver slamming the door shut again behind me. Hagrid barked out a variation on the locking charm, his command over the gates giving him the authority to engage the barrier enchantments on the building. Finally feeling safe, I slumped back down against the stone. I got about 3 seconds of rest before a massive tongue swiped my face, Fang apologizing for fleeing and checking that I was okay. While Hagrid handled explaining to the Quidditch team what had just happened, I idly pet the giant boarhound with my free hand, laying on the cold stone and getting my breath back. While it seemed like forever in adrenaline-fueled moments, it had probably only been a few minutes since the attack started, so it was still just the refugees from the Fey onslaught in the room. I started to think about next steps and wonder how long it would take for the professors to get down and start reinforcing the wards. Honestly, it should still be at least an hour until curfew. Where was everyone? Where is everyone? I put that thought to words, directed at the twins. Everyone else looked at them expectantly as well. It doesn't work right if you all watch, Fred groused, while George hid behind him and pulled out the map that we all pretended we didn't know they had, tapping it with his wand and whispering the activation phrase. After a moment of perusal, George explained, "Everyone's in bed, looks like. Where they're supposed to be. Nobody but us is moving." I was willing to take for granted that some kind of sleeping beauty fairy bullshit had happened, rather than everyone being dead. If everyone was dead, we had real problems. Maeve, I wondered, aloud. He moved down to one of the bottom corners of the map and said, "In the dungeons, with the other snakes." That was good, at least. I'd rather have her getting her alibi sorted rather than ready to run interference in the castle. I tiredly sat up and suggested, "Split up and see if we can figure out why everyone's asleep. I'll see if I can wake up Dumbledore." "I'll protect the doors," Hagrid offered, slotting in another crossbow bolt. "Harry, take Ginny with you and check Gryffindor." Angelina took charge. She was the prefect for her year and Wood's likely replacement as Quidditch captain the next year, so it made sense. She quickly sorted the rest of the team into pairs to check the other common rooms and nearby professors' quarters. As we hiked up the stairs toward the 7th floor, Ginny mused, "It's not like it is in the books, is it?" "Words have a hard time with the smell, at the very least," I agreed, seeing where the little adventure novel aficionado was going. Battles were hard enough without dwelling on the sense of blood, unwashed monsters, and flesh burned by spellfire and iron. "I need to get better," she nodded. "It's one thing when they're meeting you on the field of battle. It's another when they're pouncing on you in the dark. Yeah, nobody really stands in a line and trades shots anymore. It was kind of dumb that they ever did it that way. And dueling isn't like real fighting." What the tiniest Weasley decided was lost, as we were surprised by actual sunlight streaming in from the top floor windows as we crested the stairs to our common room entrance. Sunrise was happening at a rapid pace, when as far as I knew it was not even 9 at night. "Time weirdness," I growled, remembering all the stories of people walking into the land of the fairies and coming out years later unchanged. "We need to solve this fast." The painting of the fat lady that guarded our common room door was also asleep, but fortunately the password magic didn't actually rely on her, a fact that many first years caught out after curfew failed to realize. We stepped in to see several students sprawled out on the couches and chairs. Mathilda was in her classic waiting-up chair with a good view of the door. Percy, Alexis, and a few of the other kids that were usually the last up to bed were also zonked out as if they'd fallen asleep wherever they were sitting. "Time acceleration and a sleep spell," I guessed, aloud. Ginny just shrugged and went to shake her brother. I moved over and gently tried shaking my girlfriend's shoulder. "Hey, Thilda, wake up." Neither roused, not even making the normal noises of a deeply sleeping teen refusing to get up. Finite incantatum. I tried the general counterspell and then enervate. Neither worked. "We don't even have spinning wheels in the castle," I complained. Ginny, having tried shaking the rest of the kids, gave me a look, caught my reference, and grinned. "Well, there's one thing only you can try." I blanched, getting her meaning. Trust the story-obsessed teen to realize the skeleton key to fairy-induced comas. I leaned over, nervous. This would be a really embarrassing time to find out that what I had wasn't true love. Live within you, fortunately. Whatever I had with Mathilda was close enough for fairy enchantments. Or maybe the delighted, high-pitched noise that Ginny started making when she saw my girlfriend stir under my kiss was on precisely the right wavelength to destroy the spell. My dangerous wizard vibe was going to be completely destroyed once it got out how adorable the second year found me. "We can go get Oliver to wake up Alexis too," Ginny mused. "I don't know if that's the best idea right now," I frowned, breaking away from Mathilda, worried about how this whole night had started with trying to convince him to pay more attention to his girlfriend than to Quidditch. "Well, good morning to you, too," Mathilda said as she woke, cutting off any reply from Ginny. "Fall asleep on the couch." "Everyone did," Ginny explained. "You were under a fairy spell, but Harry kissed you awake." That got her up the rest of the way, her eyes clearing and flicking between us as she processed. "You're still dressed the same, so I didn't miss years then?" she finally asked. "Like half an hour," I answered. I gestured to the visibly moving shadows in the room from the daylit window and corrected myself. "Time seems to be wonky, though. I think the whole castle is in the Never-Never." "That's not good. Ask Bob." "Who's Bob?" Ginny inquired. Mathilda winced at the mistake in her waking state. I sighed but shrugged. I was 5 months from being out on my own, and it would be harder for the adults to take him away if the secret got out, but I tried. "You have to keep this quiet. Even more than about your brother's map." "What map?" Ginny asked, with a wink miming buttoning her lips closed. Wizards didn't know about zippers. I regarded her for a second, then nodded, reaching into my bag of holding and withdrawing the skull where it had sat the entire time we'd been outside. Fortunately, the undetectable extension inside came with a lot of padding, so he'd never been in danger from me taking hits and rolling around on the ground. Actually, if the school was currently in the Never Never, how did that impact all the expanded spaces that normally pushed into the Never Never? I made a mental note to solve that little arithmetic problem later. Barb's eye flames sprung to life, seemingly unaffected by the daylight, as the mostly nocturnal spirit would be in the real world, and he glanced around curiously. "What have you got me into now, Harry?" he complained. Mathilda reached over and shut Ginny's mouth before she could ask the obvious questions, whispering that she'd explain later. So I quickly summed up what had happened since I got down to the Quidditch pitch, for both Mathilda's and Barb's edification. "Yeah, you're right. We're definitely more in the Never Never than Earthside right now," Barb agreed with my assessment as I finished. "Take me over to a window." I obliged, and he looked out across the grounds that we could see from Gryffindor Tower, the sun already most of the way overhead, ours obviously passing in minutes. "Looks like a several hundred-yard radius centered on the castle. Got most of the forest and the town. I hadn't noticed that Hogsmeade had been taken, but I winced out. Hope they're handling the ferry invaders okay." From up here, it was pretty obvious that the normal landscape abruptly cut off not far outside the school grounds. Maybe you wouldn't immediately notice if you weren't looking for it, as I hadn't just walking into the room, but the distant landmarks were missing, and the whole thing looked almost like a painted background from an old Technicolor movie, not really intended for close scrutiny. "That's a very specific radius," Bob continued. "I don't think you could get an inversion this big without several anchors around the perimeter. If it's just past Hogsmeade, it might extend to the Wrath." I mused, thinking of the ferry mound I'd used to apparate on 2 occasions. The girls had joined me by the window, looking out. Below, movement on the grounds indicated that various fey creatures were continuing to explore, though they were more careful in the light, most skittering quickly across to lurk against walls or trees. "That might be one," Barb allowed. "I'd need to get up on the astronomy tower to judge the exact radius, but it seems like it's pretty firmly centered on the castle. You'd either need several more anchors, each the same distance from the building, or some kind of powerful source inside the building." I groaned. "Like a room that can be anything you want, and open doorways out to about the radius that's being affected." My guess specifically prevented me from explaining where the girls could hear that it was also under Maeve's control and deeply linked to the school's connection to the Never Never. But I'd shared that fact with Barb privately after it happened. "That would probably do it," he admitted. "I guess let's go see if we can fix the room of requirement," I said. Of course, I'd expected Mathilda to follow me. I hadn't quite expected Ginny to come along. I probably should have, due to her adventurous nature and irrepressibility. "Percy's going to kill me if you come along," I told the girl. It was weird, because the big brother in question was asleep on the couch 5 feet away when I said it. "I'll tell him that I blackmailed you," the redhead shrugged. "Big blackmail," Mathilda nodded, though I caught in her eyes that she too was a little worried about bringing a 12-year-old along. She was being hoist with her own petard by insisting that I accept help in dangerous situations, so couldn't exactly ban someone else who wanted to so without sounding like a hypocrite. "Implicates us both." "Fine. But if you get hurt and don't die, he's also going to kill you, so be careful," I admonished. I stowed Bob back in the bag, assuming I might need his input once we got to the room, and checked my foci. Mathilda and Ginny both got their wands out, and we exited the common room. The room of requirement entrance was only a short walk from Gryffindor Tower, and there was, as expected, a door manifested and ajar in the wall. What was not expected was 24 house elves in Hogwarts-crested towel togas spread out around the hallway. In hindsight, I should probably have been more worried about Maeve co-opting the castle's large staff of fey creatures. "This hallway be off limits," a particularly wizened elf announced in a high-pitched voice, wrinkled hand held up officiously to cause us to halt. The rest of the crowd of tiny, big-eared humanoids stood on guard as their leader hailed us. Most of them were barely taller than my knee. but I wasn't totally sure how dangerous their magic was when actually unleashed against humans. Wait, could they even attack us? Everything I knew about house elves centered on their loyalty to their masters, and for school elves, that might include all the staff and students. Who has declared the hallway off limits? I asked. The young queen, their spokes elf admitted. But not the headmaster, I asked. Has the headmaster given you orders to prevent students from using these facilities? The old elf frowned, a hand reaching up to twist her own ear in concentration. We must serve the queen. We must serve the castle, she grit out. Oh no, Mathilda said. Classic Ku Chulin situation, conflicting Jesus. I nodded. This wasn't exactly an evil witch with a bowl of dog-meat stew, but actually, I vaguely remembered that Maeve was the name of the queen that the Celtic hero fought, so it kind of fit. Was she the original Maeve of the myth? No time to get sidetracked by interpreting mythology. I instead fell back on a more recent myth. Like Sarah to Sir Didymus in Labyrinth, I simply asked, "What exactly have you sworn?" "We is to watch the hallway and keep any from entering the room," she explained grudgingly. "And if you had to be somewhere else and couldn't watch the hallway," I suggested. "We can't knows what we can't sees," she allowed, after worrying her ear for another few seconds of thought. "Aren't you all needed in the kitchens?" I nodded. After all, we must have missed several meals so far. "And you's not go in the room while we sees to other duties?" she asked, with feigned suspicion. "Nope, just right back to the common room," Ginny piped up, fingers crossed behind her back. I was glad she took the initiative on that lie, since I had enough Jesus of my own that lying in this situation might roll back on me somehow. The elf considered for a minute, looking at the others. They mostly seemed relieved that they weren't going to have to fight us. Unless I was really underestimating elf magic, we could take them. Even if they won, assaulting students would probably invoke some severe punishment from their oaths. Finally, the elf nodded and ordered, "Breakfast is past, and lunch too. Lots of cookery to catch up on. To the kitchens, all." They all scurried away. After they were out of earshot, Mathilda said, "Poor little guys, but we should warn Dumbledore. Next time she might tell them to do something that doesn't conflict." "Like spying on the whole school," I nodded. I wondered if the castle could even work without a whole force of indentured enemy combatants. I nudged open the door all the way, and we walked into basically the same setup as Maeve had tricked me in when she claimed the room, stairways at all angles and orientations. "Through dangers untold and hardships unnumbered," Mathilda quoted, getting a good look at it. "Why are the stairs on the ceiling?" Ginny asked, unfamiliar with either Escher or Muggle fantasy films. More importantly, why is that column on the ceiling? I'd finally spotted the column with the glyph Maeve had used to claim the room, but it was basically opposite where it had been originally, stuck to a landing a dozen yards above our heads. I pointed it out to the girls. "That's what we're after, but there's no way," I began, stepping onto a stairway that peeled off at a gravity-defying angle. There was. By pulling us into the Never Never, she'd solved the issue with being limited to Earth's gravity. As soon as I set both feet on the stairs, my stomach pulled sideways, and suddenly it looked like Mathilda and Ginny were standing on a wall. Right, do I try to find a path to the column, or do I take the leap of faith? I mused out loud. Mathilda just rolled her eyes at me and asked, "Are you a wizard or not? Wingardium Leviosa." With her swish and flick, she levitated me by my clothes until I floated near enough to the column for the local gravity to take over. I flipped ungainly to the ground that used to be ceiling, now staring up at the girls inverted on what seemed to be the ceiling. "Right, good point," I admitted. "Get ready to do that again once I cancel this." She shot me a thumbs up. "Got it. Ginny, keep an eye on the door." The littlest Weasley nodded, but only spared an average of one eye. There was no way she was going to miss whatever stupid magical thing I was doing, and kept glancing back and forth. I pulled Bob back out of my pouch so he could see the rune and asked, like we discussed. He looked it over and hummed in agreement. "Yep, just sever the central junction and renounce. But stow me safely first. You're going to smash your skull open in a second. No reason to risk mine." "Glad to know we're in this together," I grumbled at him, but returned him to the bag of holding and pulled out some carving tools from my belt. "Okay, about to do this." I shouted down to Mathilda, placed the chisel across the most important section of the glyph, and defaced it while shouting, "This witness reclaims that which was taken under false pretense, and used to harm the wizards of Hogwarts. With a burst of cold air, the glyph flared and then disappeared from the column, only my gouged mark left to deface the column. There was a sudden pressure differential, like rising on an airplane or coming up too fast from underwater, making my ears pop. With a very brief sensation like I'd been turned inside out, gravity reasserted itself. Arresto momentum, Mathilda managed, before I broke my head open on the space where she stood, which had won the argument about what got to be the floor. As I floated like a feather down to the ground, I laughed like a madman and shouted in the vague direction of where Maeve was hiding in the Slytherin dorms, "You have no power over me." Mathilda joined in the laughter. Ginny just looked back and forth between us and finally asked, "Are you both quoting something?" Chapter 39, Hexcarn 11, Aftershock. Chapter text signing bonuses fixing the room of requirement had taken long enough in the screwed-up never-never time that it was already fully dark. An entire day passed in minutes. We'd caught everyone else still awake up on what happened, then had a tense few hours to see if people were actually going to wake on their own. Even though the twins could see her moving around a bit on their map, Maeve had the good sense to hide in the Slytherin dorms. If we'd had the password or she came out, it could have gotten violent. I wasn't actually sure whether she'd be able to defeat me, Mathilda, Hagrid, and the whole Gryffindor Quidditch team. She likely would have at least seriously injured us in the process, so I was grudgingly happy we didn't have to find out. Hagrid was uncommonly okay with helping with the violence once Mathilda explained to him that Maeve was behind everything. His good nature didn't extend to people that endangered his animals, especially if they were already in Slytherin. After a tense few hours in the dark, fortunately, the denizens of the castle began to wake with the dawn. He split up to inform the headmaster and heads of house what had happened, had breakfast, the elves had made a lot, and then went to bed. Everyone else was acting like they'd had 36 hours of sleep, instead of the few hours of subjective time those awake had experienced, while we were effectively up way past our normal bedtimes. We slept right through lunch, and what we discovered was indeed Sunday, but Dumbledore had been off since we debriefed him anyway, gathering information from the ministry. He wound up interrupting dinner to make his announcements. "I'm sure most of you have discovered that Hogwarts was placed into an enchanted slumber, and that today is Sunday, rather than the Saturday you expected. What you may not have heard is that the school in Hogsmeade briefly disappeared. Auras sent to the location found only a primeval forest in our location. I understand from the few not enchanted into slumber that, during this missing period, we were in the realm of the fairies. Fortunately, the damage from marauding creatures is minimal. This appears to have been part of a series of gambits to bring the Ministry and Iqua to the negotiation table. I understand several other magical schools disappeared as well, and the entire city of Milwaukee in the United States, which holds one of their most populous wizarding districts. These gambits were successful. The nations of the Iqua have once again signed the Unseelie Accords, which primarily govern relations with other intelligent magical races. This should hopefully have little impact on you in the near future, but I have encouraged Professor Binns to research the Accords and explain them in upcoming classes. Though we've lost a day, our class schedule is not affected, so I encourage everyone to get any homework they plan to do over the weekend finished after we finish eating. Dig in. I glanced over to the Slytherin table, where Maeve was shooting me an unreadable look, which wasn't the smug victory face I'd expected. Maybe she'd planned to get away with it entirely and wasn't pleased that I'd removed her control over the room and drastically increased the scrutiny she'd receive from the rest of staff going forward. Still, didn't exactly feel like a victory. That evening was such a frantic scramble for all of Gryffindor to get their weekend homework, finished that there weren't even a ton of questions for me and the Quidditch team about what had happened. I managed to catch most of the way back up on my sleep and get through my Monday classes before Percy and Alexis made Oliver, and me tell them the whole story while we waited for Penny at our afternoon spellcrafting session. Ravenclaw Prefect finally showed up about 20 minutes late with an armload of notes. "Sorry, I had to go check something in the library. I think I've cracked it. We've been stuck on the final apology for a while, mostly in finding a workable incantation that fit the rest of the arithmancy. Is this your dream you told me about?" Percy asked. Penny nodded, spreading her notes out on the table. I guess an enchanted sleep was good for something. Really let my sleepy time brain work the problem. Also, Harry, I hate you. What did I do? I asked, the picture of innocence. You know the stupid incantation you wanted to use, she began. I nodded, because I jokingly suggested that we should use hocus pocus, since this was the opposite of the killing curse, which basically sounded like abracadabra. Right number of syllables, but it didn't fit the arithmancy. I shrugged. What I remembered in my dream was something I read about one of the theories of where hocus pocus came from. I looked it up and it fits. So, I hate you. She shoved over the final notes page, where she'd underlined hoc est corpus on the sheet. I beamed and asked, thoughts on the emotion? Well, since the killing curse is hate, and I heard about how you woke up Thilda, Penny began, getting a bit of the same romantic look in her eyes Ginny had been sporting every time she looked at me for the past day. Percy, understanding what was expected of him, looked deeply into his girlfriend's eyes, pointed his wand to our downrange wall in the classroom, and did the wand gesture while breathing, hoc est corpus. The blast of orange-red light, shot through with streamers of silver, almost looked like what happened when Dumbledore's phoenix teleported. It splashed against the masonry, leaving a momentary field of glowing color that evaporated harmlessly from the inanimate object. Beaming, Penny mirrored the cast, having a similar effect. I grinned at how lost in each other's eyes my friends were, shrugged, and thought of Mathilda, adding my own splash of anti-wraith energy to the collection. Alexis was now looking expectantly at Oliver, who hadn't even pulled out his wand yet. He was also smiling at the spectacle of Penny and Percy, and it took him a minute to realize his girlfriend was staring at him. The wand gesture for this one's complicated, he said, somewhat defensively. Ali, why didn't you wake me up like Harry woke up Thilda? The burly Scotsman shrugged, explaining, we were downstairs while Harry and Ginny checked the 7th floor. Harry, how long was it between when you fixed the room and when the sleeping spell wore off? She asked, adding me to the brewing fight. I mean, time was messed up, so there's no way to be totally sure, I hedged, but her eyes were narrowing and I shrugged helplessly at Oliver. Couple hours. She turned back to her boyfriend and asked, maybe you just didn't think about it. But well, the wand gestures aren't that hard. Taking a deep breath to marshal his courage, Oliver nodded, looked Alexis in the eyes, and incanted, hoc est corpus. His wand gesture was fine. He got a pinkish mist, similar to trying to cast a Patronus without a strong enough memory. Alexis just nodded, sadly. She looked back at Oliver, whispered the incantation, and her own fully formed blast of light hit where the rest of them had. Wiping a tear from her eye, she walked out of the room without another word. Hormones, tell us about the Harbs, please, Harry, Luna suggested. Her quill was poised in a stance that I'd come to regard as her journalism mode rather than just being a student. The other Ravenclaw and Slytherin second years looked on in anticipation. They haven't been seen in Britain for ages. It was shocking how fast the wizarding world could adjust to their new status quo. It hadn't been a week since Hogwarts had received unarguable proof of the Never Never. Britain had signed a long-forgotten pact with the Fae, and the entire school had been forced into slumber while creatures menaced the grounds, and it was all becoming just another piece of weird history. The full moon came. I had to sub for Remus classes, and the kids were more interested in unusual creatures than in the extra-dimensional politics. Mathilda's class, the period before, had basically asked the same kinds of things, but endured me trying to teach them the Liberator's charm instead. Shadowy, mean, and prone to getting lured into the Whomping Willow, I explained. They're pretty similar to demiguises, so I guess we can talk about those too. Luna had already hit me up about my general exploits over the previous weekend, and I wasn't sure how much was going to make it into the Quibbler. Apparently, the tabloid was experiencing a sudden surge in readership, since they'd been vindicated in the December edition as the only ones that had been talking about the Fae. Fortunately, the Daily Prophet had so far been uninterested in interviewing me, possibly because Rita was their only reporter I'd ever talked to, and she was more interested in my family and love life. I managed to make it through the class interview, and my own year was next. It was as intense as most of my classes had been all week. Oliver and Alexis were still pointedly not talking. Charms, Transfiguration, and Defense, the classes they still had in common, had required a frantic reshuffling of partners. My own relationship with my grandmother, head of house, and Transfiguration professor was still strained, so McGonagall's class, in particular, had been very tense. She was hesitant to make a big deal of forcing a reorganization of partners, and Remus wasn't an experienced enough professor yet to know how to handle it. Flitwick, at least, was immune to the teen drama and took it all in stride. After a sedate lunch and after-lunch period, I got to the fun part of my Friday afternoon, when I had the third and fourth years in Gryffindor and Hufflepuff for my last 2 periods. Field trip, everyone, I told Hermione's class, and led them out toward the grounds, where Hagrid was planning to meet us with his own afternoon Newt class of 7th years in tow. That Newt class was just the students that had dropped charms, where I should have been if I hadn't been covering for Remus. "What are we doing, Harry?" Hermione asked. It clearly still grated on her every time she called me that instead of Professor Dresden in my role as Remus' substitute, but I wasn't angling to be anything more than a tar and didn't want to put on airs. "Looking into the kind of damage magical creatures can do," I explained. Fortunately, only a couple of the hippogriffs had died, but several had taken wounds from the griffins. Similarly, only a few griffins had been injured enough that they couldn't flee, but their corpses were an excellent demonstration of what hippogriffs could do in a fight. As far as we could tell, the Thestrals had gotten away unscathed with bellies full of pixies, and the Harbs had left the different types of flying horses alone. But there were a few pixies to show off that had died from being punted into structures by our spells, and Hagrid, the Willow, and I had made a couple of Harb corpses to show off. Even with preserving charms, this was probably the last day we could show them off before they needed to be cut up for components, and then disposed of before they started to stink. On the way down to the grounds, the class formed a bit of a parade behind me, with Hermione's clique immediately behind and the rest of the kids stretching back in their own little friend groups. While they were trying to be quiet so as not to be overheard by the rest of their classmates, I had no problem hearing the discussion. Seamus continued some discussion they'd apparently been having earlier. "Come on, I'll ask Bonesy and then you ask Abbott. Easy. You and Bones," Ron scoffed. "What? Just 'cause I ain't a proper pureblood, maybe she'll like a lil tryst why a bad boy. Points for knowing the word tryst, at least," Hermione interjected. "But I think she and Macmillan are together." "I can't go to Hogsmeade for Valentine's anyway," Neville explained, grudgingly. I glanced back and caught a look of longing from him as he gazed at the object of his affections. I'd seen him shooting the same looks at Hannah Abbott the last time I'd subbed for their class as well. Ah, the fun of when young wizards and witches discovered each other. "Your parents will let you go. Black hasn't been seen in a month," Ron argued. There was a brief silence, which I assumed was the rest of them staring at him for how dumb that was, or at me realizing that I'd been the one who'd last seen him. I kept my eyes front, letting them work it out themselves. "Or we could just smuggle you out in the cloak." "We will not." Hermione insisted, her voice rising enough that the others shushed her as we passed through the castle doors out onto the grounds. Seamus mused. "Double date in the greenhouses. She's gotta like plants, Bane a puff." "I still don't think you and Bones," Ron began. "Nah," Seamus interrupted. "I ain't gonna try T-get in Ernie's way. I meant double Y you two." "What?" Ron and Hermione gasped at the same time. Seamus chuckled and said, "Juice, a thought." As much as I hated to interrupt Seamus calling out the romantic tension that had sprung into their friend group as they all hit puberty, I probably should start teaching. "This is where most of the fighting happened," I called back to the group, getting their attention and stopping the side chatter. "You'll notice the ground is still torn up from where the griffins and hippogriffs landed. That crater over there is where Hagrid brought down one of the griffins with his crossbow." I proceeded to walk them through the fight, asking questions about why different spells had worked or not on the various creatures. By the time we got to Hagrid's hut, where the bodies had been dragged, there was a lot of interest in pointing out all the bits of damage from my story. The 7th-year students in Hagrid's class helped position the bodies to show the various wounds as I and Hagrid alternated describing them. Our class was interrupted by an unearthly, high-pitched wailing coming from behind the large metal cube bin, basically a dumpster that Hagrid had next to his hut, prepared to take the unusable remains of rendering the corpses. Dead horse-sized beasts had a lot of guts. A banshee, Seamus gasped. Not in the daytime, Hermione corrected. Maybe one of the Hobbs wasn't dead. Actually, Hagrid mused, kinda sounds like a cat. Sure enough, with the third years pulling their wands out behind us as I rounded the corner with Hagrid and the seventh years not far behind, that was exactly what it was. Two very distracted cats. Crookshanks, Hermione exclaimed as she caught sight of the very educational vista before her. The exclamation scared the cats, and they separated and bolted, quickly disappearing across the grounds back toward the castle. Was that Mrs. Norris? Ron asked, bewildered. Ha! Seamus barked. "T least your cat's interested in datin. Film star, muggle clothes, was all I'd tell Mathilda about what we were doing for Valentine's Day lunch. Well, technically, since the 14th itself was on Monday, we were leaving Hogsmeade on Saturday to celebrate. I'd warned Remus what we were doing, and our friends knew we were going to London. With my enchanted rings for sending messages, we'd be pretty safe, right? Sure, it was kind of risky with vampires and Death Eaters after me, but this was the first Valentine's where we'd been really serious, and she'd already treated me to an excellent lunch for my birthday, so I wanted to do something nice. Hopefully being in the middle of the day in an unpredictable part of London would help a lot. "We aren't going into the alley. Oh, muggle clothes," Mathilda exclaimed when I led her out onto Charing Cross Road out of the leaky cauldron after we flew through from Hogsmeade. It was pretty cold in London and cloudy, but the sidewalk was clear enough for a short walk. She looked nice in clothes that were probably a bit out of date, but at least didn't stand out the way some purebloods did when they tried to dress themselves in muggle clothing. And who was I to judge trendy? "We're going to Trocadero Centre." "It should only be half a mile," I explained, setting off in what I thought was the right direction. I had the atlas my godmother had given me to identify Raths, which had a decent enough zoom in on the streets of London, so I knew I needed to cut through Leicester Square, and the whole place was optimized for tourists anyway. Which was good, because we were going to the most internationally touristy restaurant I could think of. "Meard in Mauer," she gasped, seeing the planet Hollywood before us. "Is that where we're going?" The kitschy restaurant had only been open since the past May, but I figured that was just long enough that, only trying to go for lunch, and on one of the least touristy months of the year, we had a pretty good shot of getting a table. Sure enough, the delay wasn't too bad, and Mathilda was thrilled to spend it checking out the movie memorabilia they had placed around the waiting area. And while it was trendy and cool, it was still really just an upscale burger bar, so I figured I should be able to afford it. Our table was in a section that was decorated with props from what looked to be various B-movies, and we discussed them as table conversation while we waited for our order. We'd moved on to looking at a glass-encased knife and ripped bikini that was labeled as being from a movie I hadn't heard of, Blood Beach, which had a signed photo beneath. "Looks like it was taken here," Mathilda observed. The background of the photo was, in fact, the wall we were sitting next to, with several tables pushed together to seat a party. While the handsome dark-haired man and beautiful woman posing up front in the photo were unfamiliar, one of the guests in the back was. "I think that's Thomas Wraith from the Malfoy party." I pointed him out to her. "Could be," she squinted. "I didn't get close to him. Someone your godmother was talking to." I carefully failed to shake my head, which she knew to take as agreement past my gash, and she suggested, "I can see a family resemblance between him and the other two." Assuming wizarding purebloods would have a pretty good sense for when people looked related, as the waitress dropped off our food I gestured at the display and asked, "What's the deal with this one? I haven't heard of Blood Beach." She tried to hide a faint eye roll and said, "You wouldn't have. It's not even out yet." They were in here last month doing a promo tour and screened it for us. "I don't think it's going to win any awards. That's Darby Crane and Lara Romani," she explained, able to pass the signatures. "He's the director and was kind of a creep, honestly. She's pretty, but she probably isn't good enough to make it in Hollywood." "And the guys in the background?" I asked. "Family and friends, crew," she shrugged. "I don't remember them being in the movie, so I don't think they were actors." "We're all very cute. Good tippers, especially that one." She gestured to Thomas and got a dreamy look in her eye. Anyway, do you need any more condiments? After we assured the server everything looked fine and started eating, Mathilda had a look in her eyes like she was thinking, and eventually offered, I might have actually heard of it. You know how I mentioned the Malfoys produce movies, so we see them to make sure they don't break the statute. I remember Uncle Abraham mentioning there was a new one. But then it turned out it wasn't really about magic at all. I think it was this one. I thought back to Wraith's warning about Mavra, and my godmother mentioning he was a Malfoy cousin. I think we should finally ask Draco about this whole White Court thing. After finishing lunch and doing a bit more tourism in the Muggle side of London, that's what we did next. We managed to catch sight of the smallest Malfoy later in the afternoon in Hogsmeade as he was heading into the bookstore. In there, his little bodyguards, who were starting to be not so little, would wander off and amuse themselves with coloring books or something, allowing us to have a private conversation. Tactful as always, Mathilda sidled up to him and asked quietly, So you're a vampire, Draco? The boy turned and didn't seem surprised to see both of us. I thought you'd ask about that months ago, he drawled. Other things kept coming up, I shrugged. We just remembered because we saw a picture of your cousins Thomas, Darby, and Lara at lunch. Blood Beach, he asked. We nodded and he complained, I don't know why Father funded that. Guess it was part of whatever was going on at New Year's. I hear it's terrible. So implied the waitress, Mathilda admitted. Draco regarded us both for a minute, probably calculating whether it was worth it to try to bargain for the information versus staying in our overall good graces by offering a freebie. He finally decided on the latter and explained, I'm not a vampire. As far as I know, the hunger, that's what they call it, capital H, eats all the magic in your soul and uses it to provide the powers. Like werewolves, I nodded. Could be. Anyway, our line are basically vampire squibs from their point of view, which meant we could be wizards. The families broke off centuries ago, but we've kept in touch. I don't think any Malfoy has been White Court ever since. Doesn't really sound like how vampires are supposed to work, Mathilda wondered. More like Vila, really, he admitted. That hunger is basically a bonded spirit that gives them strength, speed, that kind of thing, but they need to drain emotions from people to feed it. The Wraiths are the most powerful line, and for them it's a whole sex thing. Our ancestors were more about fear. I'd check that all out with Bob later, but wondered aloud. So, with the Unseelie Accords now in effect, could your family claim membership in the White Court, even though they don't have a hunger, when it was legally useful? Draco grinned like a little baby predator, gave me a slightly patronizing pat on the back and said, Harry Dresden will make a politician of you yet. He took his leave and Mathilda sighed. Guess that's what the Malfoys are getting out of siding with your godmother. Do dragons get special privileges? I have to tell my dad to get in on this. It would explain why Mr. Ferro was at the party, I thought out loud. There may be a lot more political ramifications of this than Bob thought, she frowned and asked, and they're still mostly out. Signing the accords didn't include opening the veil. I don't think so. Then they're probably not even done yet, she concluded. Et tu, March 15th was not a good day for this. You'd think even with the divorce from Muggle literature, the wizards of Shakespeare's Britain would be a little wary of the Ides of March. Plus, it was a Tuesday, so all the seventh years involved had to miss potions class, when just doing it on Monday would have only involved missing defense class, which this was. To be fair, most classes were cancelled anyway, since all the professors also had to be on the grounds with the seventh-year defense students, waiting for the horde of giant spiders to come boiling out of the forbidden forest. According to Draco, this had been the only day that worked. Lucius Malfoy had been true to his word of spending the winter trying to deal with the acromantula problem in the forest. He'd hired creature experts to clear out the easy nests and cut off any avenues of escape. But the central nests held a ridiculous number of the class quintuplex creatures, as Hermione's crew could attest to from their misadventure the year before. Between scheduling the hit wizards and getting buy-in from the astrology-obsessed centaurs, March 15th was the day that worked for everyone. The plan was to try to burn the central nest and force the spiders south. They'd either be forced out of the forest into open terrain where the secondary team could pick them off, or they'd be stampeded into the lake. Acromantulas were not known to be excellent swimmers, and the merfolk had been convinced to clean up their drowned bodies. But given the geography and other hazards of the forest, Everyone was pretty much assuming that there'd be no way to herd them perfectly, and it was very likely part of the horde would spill out onto the Hogwarts grounds down by the greenhouses. Thus, the most combat-capable professors and the seventh-year defense students were waiting in a battle line for the fight to commence, with the fifth and sixth years standing further back in case it went very wrong, or at least to quickly triage spider bites. It wasn't even a nice day for it. Biting winds hit us from behind as we waited, but the mass of clouds above was so vast that they weren't in any danger of getting pushed ahead and giving us direct sunlight. At least the open vegetable gardens were well and truly fallow beneath the snow, so we weren't wiping out the food supply with our battleground, though venomous spider guts might not be great fertilizer. I still dunno why we darn Zeus let the poor lil things alone, Hagrid complained from where he'd set up near us. Despite his objections, he'd come with a full complement of crossbow quarrels. In this kind of fight, they were better than spells. Most of us were set up to banish heavy spikes at the creatures, since most spells would just roll off. They tried to eat the kids last year, Penny reminded him. They just got overexcited, the big man argued. I know not to send any more students into their territory. I think we're more worried about Riddle or his people using them against the school, I explained. I'd explained it before. To be honest, though, it did feel a little bad to be planning to exterminate a bunch of sentient creatures. Too many monsters in the magical world talked. How is it that Aragog never told you about his queen? Percy asked, trying a distraction for the half-giant. And how inbred are they? Oliver wondered. I heard Alexis near me bite back a laugh at her ex-boyfriend's joke. Things were still tense. Less talking, please, Remus suggested from the center of our group of Newt students. I think they're coming. A moment later I heard it too, the sound of spellfire and masses of large, armored creatures careening off of trees. Dumbledore and McGonagall were with the herding force, helping transfigure the terrain to keep the spiders from charging the hit wizards or leaping over the lines from the trees. And I thought I could see the progression of the battle as trees temporarily bent themselves toward us to ground the spiders. And then, like the wave at a sports stadium, the bowing trees reached the edge of the forest, and possibly hundreds of chitinous black forms scurried onto the grounds. If these were just the ones they couldn't force into the lake or the killing field across the train tracks, then there must have been over 1,000 of the monsters in the forest. Gasping, Hagrid realized. Aragog said there was Zeus, a few kids. Why have they been eaten? I absently wondered how much of the normal wildlife of the forest had been made into spider food in the last half-century, but then the carpet of spiders wheeled toward us. And then it was just the shouts of Depulso. To banish spikes, the twang of Hagrid's crossbow, and the students gifted in transfiguration, raising obstacles from the earth. The line of charging beasts quickly began to falter against the onslaught, bending as if considering taking their chances diving into the lake after all, the spells of the herding force chasing them from behind. But then, from the center of the undulating mass, a deep voice bellowed, "No, forward! We must escape through." The voice came from what I'd initially thought was several spiders clumped together, the volleys of projectiles and speed making it hard to visually distinguish the mass. Looking directly at it, though its carapace was less shiny than the others, and the whole thing was so big it could have been a special effect mounted on a full-sized cargo van with none of the vehicle showing. While its eyes were roomy, it apparently could sense well enough to direct the charge. Apparently picking out a smell, upwind as we were from it, the presumed Aragog shouted, "Hagrid, why? Why do you kill my children?" I noted that the spider wasn't exactly slowing down to parley, and was on a direct line for the gamekeeper, and since I was close by, me and my friends. Groaning with the emotional pain, Hagrid yelled back, "Sorry, old friend. You was never meant to have so many. How many other critters have they killed?" The noise was immense, our entire firing line trying to break the charge, explosions and projectiles reverberating through shattering exoskeletons as the creatures got within 30 feet, 20, 10. His descendants crushed beside him, the blind spider barely seemed to notice, his own thick shell deflecting all attacks until, mere feet from the man who'd raised him, one final thrum of Hagrid's immense crossbow launched a bolt into the rearing spider's underside. Aragog crashed into the turf, sliding to a stop, as those nearest the gamekeeper retreated hurriedly backwards, out of reach of the long, clawed legs. But the gigantic acromantula merely began to twitch in its death throes, losing hydraulic control of its extremities, and plaintively whispered, "I only did what was in my nature." Hagrid dropped to his knees and began to sob, and I awkwardly patted him on the shoulder, regarding the still-twitching ruins of an entire family line of vicious but sentient creatures spread out in the cloudy light across the blasted field. With vanishing charms, the corpses would probably be gone as if they'd never been within a week. Dumbledore seemed almost as sad to look out across the killing field as he walked from the forest, trees righting themselves behind him. The other professors and hit wizards that filed out behind him seemed none the worse for wear, and most looked to our side to make sure that no students had been injured. Remus walked over to meet the headmaster, and I followed because I'm nosy. "Any sign of Black?" he asked. Dumbledore nodded. "We found a small cave that looks like it could be where he was sleeping. We could use you to confirm the scent, of course, but it looks like he hasn't been there in months. Maybe he found somewhere warmer for the winter," I theorized. "Perhaps," the old man agreed, but then suggested, "or perhaps your encounter with him over the holidays introduced him to allies of whom he was previously unaware." Great. Possessed animagi and vampires teamed up together. What could go wrong? Chapter 40, HexCon 12, Movie Night. Chapter text adult movie. I got us tickets to the movie. Mathilda enthused, reading a letter she'd gotten at breakfast a couple of weeks before spring break. It was a Saturday morning, so not too many other kids were at the table to overhear. "On my birthday. That's the first Monday of the break, right?" I asked. She nodded. "Wait, which movie?" "Blood Beach, of course," she grinned. I wanted to know what kind of horror movie vampires make. So I told Uncle Abraham that we should review it after all. "You're sure you want to watch a horror movie that's probably not any good on your birthday?" I checked. "If it's really bad, we can just snog," she winked. "Anyway, it's at the Dominion Cinema in downtown Edinburgh, night of the 28th. With a pause and an unusual moment of vulnerability, checking that none of the rest of the kids at the table were paying attention, she asked, "Get us a hotel nearby for the night." My eyes widened, but I wasn't going to ruin the moment by asking if she was sure. She'd been planning what would happen after she was a wizarding adult for most of the last year, so I just nodded, "Sure thing." Though I couldn't help but ask, "Should we check with Hagrid to make sure you get one last hangout with the unicorns before the break?" Mouth opened in amused shock that I'd gone there, she gasped, "Harry," and socked me in the shoulder, drawing brief stares from our fellow Gryffindors. "But yes." "I'll go ask him now." Mathilda had probably assumed I would find a wizarding hotel room and just reserve by owl, but I only knew of the 3 broomsticks and the leaky cauldron, and neither of them were exactly the kind of place I wanted to have a tryst with my girlfriend. At the very least, Rosemutter or Old Tom would gossip. Ordinarily, trying to figure out how to find a Muggle hotel from Hogwarts would have been hugely difficult, but the timing actually worked out. Ever since I'd realized I'd need to find an apartment by the summer, I'd been trying to get back in the system. I was talking about getting a place with Percy and Penny, and obviously Mathilda when she wasn't in school. And both Penny and I didn't necessarily want to be stuck living in Diagon Alley or Hogsmeade with no phone or other access to modern amenities. So I needed to be legally in the country, with a passport, maybe some kind of visa, and enough other forms of ID to rent a place. Fortunately, the Grangers knew where to start, and Tonk's dad, Ted, was a Muggle-born with a lot of experience bridging the legal issues between communities. I'd gotten special permission from Dumbledore to head out during my free periods that Monday to get passport photos taken, sign documents, and the like. So all I needed to do was also call around Edinburgh looking for a reasonably priced, i.e. pretty cheap, while not being terrifying, hotel that would rent in cash to an 18-year-old American with mostly legitimate paperwork. Easy. It actually turned out to be the American thing that worked for me. While most college kids went to the beach on their spring break, it apparently wasn't that uncommon for American tourists to whip through Edinburgh and need a hotel room. I got a place all booked up that was within my price range of remaining Muggle money, and also got my identification all sorted out. The situation with paying taxes and the visa authorizing me to stay in the country indefinitely were the bits of the paperwork that were only mostly legitimate. Ted Tonks had gotten Don't Call Me Nymphadora to pull some strings at the ministry, so I was on some kind of student visa, and I was mostly hoping that Dawlish didn't catch wind of it. Though I supposed he probably didn't want to have me deported, because it would be much harder for him to harass me back in the US. Nothing else of particular note happened before spring break other than finishing a scenario in Mathilda's Arcanos game. Oliver had wound up dropping out after his breakup with Alexis, not that he'd had much time to play with Quidditch practice anyway. We'd replaced him with Neville and Hermione, who'd expressed an interest. They wouldn't be unavailable due to Quidditch, and would provide some continuity for Mathilda's senior year when the rest of us graduated. Neville was surprisingly into it, his shyness disappearing when role-playing. He chose Druid, obviously. Hermione was about as much of a budding rules lawyer as one might expect. It took her a while to figure out that she shouldn't keep holding up the game to argue about minutia. I suspected that she might be better off playing one of the RPGs with looser rules. Amusingly, probably the one where you played vampires. I wondered whether the vampire game was as accurate about real vampires as Arcanos had turned out to be about basilisks and liches. The game did feature fancy, artsy vampires that might make movies, so I considered picking up a copy while I was wandering around Muggle Edinburgh. Mathilda was meeting me at the theatre, so I got into the city early to get the room key for the hotel. I even had a whole little rune-etched Faraday cage wallet I'd made so I wouldn't instantly demagnetize the strip on the keycard. I planned to potentially have a credit card someday. The road atlas of Raths my godmother had provided had several convenient apparition points in Edinburgh, and I wasn't too worried about destabilizing the Vale at this point. That ship had sailed, so it was a quick trip. While I was checking in, there was some splashy news show on the television behind the registration desk. A dark-haired man had his own graphical intro, with prominent blood spatters to heighten the vampire theme of the night. No way I believe the wife didn't ken what he was doing in his own house, the desk clerk insisted. What? I wondered. Fred West. He gestured at the TV. I shook my head and guessed. I haven't been following the news. Serial killer. T's been on every channel for weeks. The guy seemed baffled. Maybe no in the States, he figured, catching on to my accent. Yeah, I don't really watch a lot of TV either, I undersold. He nodded, accepting that, and explaining, it's ne'er the ones ye'd expect. Man with a family, killing his own daughters and others in his own home. The wife had to ken. He finished ringing me up. Check-out's at 10, and that's you done. Thanks, I told him, not sure what to make of a serial killer's trial gripping the nation when so much more terrifying stuff was going on. I'd heard they'd put up Sirius Black as an escaped murderer as well, and that was apparently not getting as much airplay these days. Did they even know that a whole city had disappeared for a weekend in the US, or had the American wizards managed to cover that up somehow? I checked that the room was nice enough, but did not leave my stuff there just in case I didn't get to use it, and was without a change of clothes. I'd learned after New Year's. I was without my staff again, but was otherwise armed to the teeth just in case my time outside of the castle went wrong as usual. After that, it was just a nice stroll down to the theatre. The weather wasn't too bad for Scotland in early spring. It was maybe even 50 degrees when I wasn't getting the light rain whipped into me by the brisk wind. Environmental charms on my duster were quite possibly the best enchanting decision I'd ever made. The city was neat, all old brick buildings in long rows with narrow roads between them. I crossed over a quay from the hotel and passed a nice park, but was otherwise penned in by the old masonry, houses, shops, and churches, all integrated into the same space-conserving rows. This was probably a much better way to make a city walkable than the wide, car-friendly roads in most American cities. I actually overshot the theater as I walked past the first time, not expecting the Art Deco cinema to just be completely shoved in among a bunch of houses down a side street from most of the commercial shops of Morningside. Mathilda waved as I headed down Newbattle Terrace, and hoping that wasn't foreshadowing of fights to come, stepping out from a cluster of her family. After getting a quick hug and kiss, I greeted her uncle, her oldest sister, and Giselle, I presume. The second oldest sister, the dragon veterinarian, looked a lot more like Mathilda than Edith did, though taller, keeping her hair extremely short. She sized me up and nodded, punctual at least. Let's go in and get seats. Not waiting for the little brothers, I asked, joking. To their great chagrin, Abraham nodded. They're arguing that they should get to see The Crow in recompense next month. I recalled reading the graphic novel while treating comic shops as my personal library and shrugged. I've read the source material. Pretty dark, but probably at least not as gory as a slasher movie. I felt a brief moment of premonition that I was going to be in a lot of trouble from Mathilda's stepmom in a month. Maybe I could have gone out for divination class. Remind me again while we're watching this one on the ministry sickle, Edith asked. Is there some kind of magical subplot? Maybe. Mathilda guessed. We're watching it because Malfoy funded his. She lowered her voice. Vampire cousins to make it. Maybe they slipped in some secrets. And maybe they're all here. I winced, spotting Lucius Malfoy across the lobby chatting with the vampire that had to be the director, Darby Crane. Draco and his mother were getting popcorn, and Thomas was lounging, bored, on one of the lobby sofas, on the opposite side from the lead actress, Lara. At least Maeve and my godmother weren't around, but there was the risk they'd already taken their seats. I thought this was just a regular screening, Mathilda gaped. Well, so did I, her uncle began, surprised as well. The ministry often gives us tickets they've gotten complimentary. I didn't realize these would be a family showing. Perhaps Lucius rented the theater. I'll get popcorn. Ah, see, the rest of the guests have arrived, Lucius told the director, quietly enough that probably only I could hear him across the relatively small lobby. A bit better than the showing at the hamburger establishment, yes. Crane rolled his eyes. It's not exactly a sellout, is it, Lucius? I was expecting some critics, at least. There are a number of students from the local colleges, and perhaps some of them write for their school tabloids, Malfoy shrugged. Including some of the older students from Harriet's school. You know, they based their schoolhouses on Hogwarts. It did seem, in addition to the various White Court relatives, there were a large number of kids around our age moving into the auditorium we were supposed to be in. I lost the rest of the conversation as I noticed Thomas striding up, a light in his eyes, as if we would save him from the boredom of attending yet another screening of his family members' B-movie. Ah, Dresden, good to see you again. I recognize your date from New Year's. And who are the rest of these lovely ladies? Edith, tight bun and conservative clothing, shielding the heart of an aspiring dowager accountant, actually tittered at the attention from the admittedly handsome vampire. Giselle was already offering her hand, and Mathilda clutched tightly at my arm with a faint gasp at being up close to a vampire that fed on sex energy. And the girl version, Lara, was also getting up to come see who her relative was talking to. What had we gotten ourselves into? White blood, the succubus Barb, at least, seemed to think that the White Court had been behind a lot of those particular myths, approached from across the lobby. Hair so glossy black it was almost blue, grey eyes, and an almost indefinable sense of perfection to her features drew the attention. I was fortunate that her expensive but tasteful ensemble was designed to protect her skin from the chilly Scottish spring, and worked equally against the gaze of teenaged wizards. Her allure was different than Maeve's. She magic marked them as impossible figures of beauty to be worshipped, while White Court enticement to go to your knees was for a different reason. I'm saying that supernatural sex appeal is a hell of a thing. Fortunately, months of resisting the she-princess, Aura, kept me from making a complete idiot of myself as she approached. Or maybe there had been truth to Barb's supposition, when I quizzed him further about the White Court, that being in love was the strongest defense against their powers. Regardless, other than a slight shift, that I hoped was subtle, to keep my pants fitting and a quick, reflexive visual scan, as if I was trying to see through her warm clothing like I had Superman's X-ray vision. I thought I did okay. Her knowing smirk said otherwise, but at least my girlfriend was probably similarly distracted by Thomas. Importantly, like me, Mathilda seemed to have more control than her sisters, who were still making noises unbecoming aspiring British matrons. "Who are your friends, Thomas?" Lara asked, finishing her languid stride across the room. I felt pretty competent at assessing combat readiness based on how people moved and paid attention to their surroundings. While she walked like she was on a Paris runway, There was an undercurrent of martial competence in the way she held herself. Thomas, too, for that matter. Both of them likely at least had enough combat training to deal with a conflict if their emotion-manipulating mojo wasn't enough. I was just finding out, Thomas answered. I met Mr. Dresden briefly at Lucius' New Year's party, but I was waiting to be introduced to the rest of his lovely friends. And their very distinguished chaperone, Lara purred at Abraham Grimblehawk, who was just walking up, somehow juggling 2 tubs of popcorn and 5 drinks. The old man, who as far as I knew was a lifelong confirmed bachelor, didn't seem affected by Lara's allure at all. Thomas either, honestly. With aplomb, he handed out drinks to our party while explaining, Abraham Grimblehawk. These are my nieces Edith, Giselle, and Mathilda, and Mathilda's boyfriend, Harry Dresden. I appreciated the warning stress he put on that relationship for both of the sex vampires, and was pretty sure I caught a small nod from Lara, as if working out our relationship status by how well both of us were resisting the white court charm. Indeed, I'm Thomas Wraith, the dark-haired young man explained to the Grimblehawks, and this is my sister, Lara. Romany, a stage name, Mathilda managed, wondering why Lara wasn't billed as a wraith. Married, she admitted, with an insouciant shrug and dismissive wave that showed off that she wasn't bothering to wear her wedding ring and somehow heavily implied it was an open relationship. So what brings wizards of your caliber to our little screening? We tend to watch most Muggle fantasy films. Make sure they aren't too accurate, Abraham explained. Normally we wouldn't screen horror, but with Malfoy investment, it seemed prudent to be certain. Assure the Ministry everything's above board. Is there magic in the plot? I asked. Only your standard unkillable killer, Thomas said, and our cousin's superpowered ego all over the production. He glanced at the director. Oh no, he's coming this way. If we could get this screening going, Darby Crane, probably not his birth name, I figured, asked fairly rudely. There's still time to run, Thomas whispered, winking, and then turned and walked away like a man headed to the gallows. I'd love to get your opinions after the film, Lara ventured, then followed her brother. I deliberately turned to look at Mathilda so as to not be accused of watching Lara leave. Edith and Giselle weren't being at all subtle about lingering on Thomas' retreating backside. Well, I guess we just need to run into some villa and we'll have the whole set, I joked. I'll journal that for the summer, shall I? Mathilda grinned. Abraham chuckled and firmly put his hands on his older niece's shoulders. Perhaps we can get some seats away from the vampires. Vampires. Both of the women boggled, then flushed as they realized what had happened. Lucius entered the theater just before us, Draco and his mother having gone ahead with a polite nod in our direction. The elder Malfoy turned and acknowledged, Abraham, the esteemed Mrs. Grimblehawk, Dresden. A bit out of your usual stomping grounds, Lucius, Abraham asked. An associate has a stake in the theater and offered the room, he shrugged. Lowering his voice so the director couldn't hear, he admitted, I'd rather not throw too many more galleons at this by paying to rent a cinema. For all that Malfoy had gotten it as a cheap favor, the room was nice, with large, plush seating. I gestured toward the back of the auditorium, where there was still some space. I usually sat in the back of theaters out of politeness. Nobody wanted to be stuck sitting behind a guy my height. I kept wondering if movie theaters were going to ever realize that the gradually sloping floor wasn't the most ideal cinematic experience. Over the previous summer, I'd read some news that AMC was going to try out a concept called stadium seating in one of the new theaters they were building in the US. Hopefully, it would catch on so I could watch films from closer up without feeling like a jerk. Malfoy had invited enough students that there weren't 5 seats together, as we were among the last in, which suited me fine. It would have killed the mood to be cuddling my girlfriend with a whole family the next seat over. The other 3 Grimblehawks got seats together a couple of rows away. Abraham shot me a vaguely amused look, and the older sisters were still enough out of it from Thomas that they barely seemed to notice. I saw that Draco had turned around to look at me, where he was sitting next to his parents in the prime central seating for the theater. Seeing he had our attention, settled on what seemed by the other young couples to be make-out row, he mouthed, "Magnets," at us with a grin before his mother chided him for not sitting properly, and he turned back to face the screen. We get no respect. Mathilda laughed before snuggling in, already digging into the popcorn we'd gotten from her uncle. He's just mad that Parkinson doesn't want to make out, I said, taking a swig of Coke. Or Ginny, she suggested, keeping hope alive for that happening. We'll see how badly she trounces him in the Quidditch rematch, I joked. Oliver's insane training had paid off, and the Gryffindor team was doing even better than the previous year. All that stood between him and the cup was the final match against Slytherin the weekend after spring break, repeating the one that had been ruined by Dementors. Is it weird I'm rooting for Draco? Mathilda asked. Don't want Arlie proved right that he should train instead of date. I shrugged. Of all the friends I'd made at Hogwarts, Oliver was the one I most expected to drift apart from after graduating. It was surprising we got along as well as we did. Probably better that they broke up on her terms than falling apart once Quidditch groupies entered the picture. There are Quidditch groupies, right? Of course. The come-ons write themselves, she acknowledged. Want to take me for a ride on your broomstick? Know how to handle a pair of bludgers, do you? Heard you knew how to find the snitch. Maybe I could learn to appreciate Quidditch after all, I grinned. If I could have everyone's attention. The officious white court cousin yelled from the front of the room, interrupting our conversation. It wasn't really a very big venue, so his voice carried. Like a lot of older movie theaters, there had probably been one or two bigger auditoriums in the building that had walls added down the middle to be able to screen more movies at once. As the crowd quieted, he said, I'm the director, Darby Crane. I and the leading lady are on hand to answer questions after the screening. And now, Blood Beach, not even a thanks for coming, Mathilda observed. Clearly we should be thanking him, I said sarcastically as the lights went down and the projector lit the screen, the film beginning to spool up. The movie was about as bad as advertised. It wasn't even entertainingly awful, competently executed but not very good. Static cameras, uninspired music, paint-by-numbers' script, and drama club acting made for a film that had earned its difficulty getting wider release. They'd at least picked a nice location to film at, some kind of lush jungle beach that I assumed was somebody's private island they'd used favors to film at. Lara Romani nee Wraith was miscast. She might have done okay as the naughty friend who gets killed off first, or maybe as a sexy bad guy of some kind, but she was not believable as the innocent final girl. She did fill out a bikini well, and I was glad she hadn't been showing much skin out in the lobby, lest my love-based resistance to her allure be sorely tested. When we finished our popcorn midway into the movie and Mathilda wanted to make out, I was all revved up and ready. Come to think of it, a lot of the theater seemed to be. The other couples in the back row with us were clearly also taking the opportunity to snog, in the local parlance, but I absently noted that quite a few of the rows featured tight embraces. We were distracted from our canoodling by an action scene, and I thought I could make out the white court vampires watching the audience and glowing faintly. Maybe it was just a weird effect of the projection light, but I wouldn't put it past them to use their sexy horror movie to feed. I wondered if the movie would get anywhere near this kind of hormonal response if there weren't 3 sex vampires in the room. It didn't actually feel like an attack or anything, and I was distracted enough to give them the benefit of the doubt that it was harmless. So I turned my attention back to Mathilda for several more scenes, until the vibe got so heavy I realized I was in danger of going too far in public. From the muffled moans down the row, some of the other kids hadn't stopped. More coke? I asked, breaking away. Eyes dilated, and not just because it was dark. She pushed a strand of hair behind an ear and nodded. Okay, lots of ice. I managed to get out into the aisle with only 6 people annoyed at me for bumping them while they were fully engaged, but I noticed movement as I was hitting the doors, and Thomas caught up to me in the little airlock between the theater and the lobby. Enjoying the movie, he grinned. Enjoying your snack, I fired back. It's the only thing that makes this little punishment detail worthwhile. I'm trying to talk Lara into just doing skin films. Skip the subterfuge. Punishment? What did you do to have to go on a movie tour? I asked, pausing before heading out into the lobby. I'm always on our father's shit list, he shrugged. He's mad at Lara for doing something so crass as starring in a movie, so she has to tour and I have to chaperone. Why'd you use your influence to get this show? I blinked. What do you mean, influence? We saw the photo and props at the Planet Hollywood. We were curious, and Mathilda asked about tickets. But we thought this was a regular screening. No clue you were going to be here. His relaxed expression fell into something more serious. We had to rush to get this screening set up. Someone was pulling strings to have it happen quickly, maybe right after your girl was asking about it. Well, that's not what I wanted to hear, I said, trying to figure out how this was going to screw me over. I didn't have to wait long at all. While I was thinking, I heard someone out in the lobby incant, stupefy, and the familiar sound of a stunner hitting a person, who then flopped to the floor. Raising a finger for silence, I peeked out into the room, though not taking part of my attention off the vampire, in case he was in on the plan. Leaning against the concessions counter was a mad-looking 30-something guy with a mop of dark blonde hair and freckles. He hadn't been in any pictures in a decade and a half, but I'd made a point of knowing who the at-large Death Eaters were, and I was pretty sure that was Barty Crouch Jr., who'd never been caught after Voldemort's fall any more than the Lestrangers had. He had, of course, a large, mangy-looking black dog with him that was even more familiar. One Death Eater and Sirius Black we could maybe take. 6 adult wizards, Draco, and 3 white court vampires, if they'd help, were pretty good odds of even doing it without upsetting the theaters full of muggles. Of course, as soon as I thought that, more figures started to enter. The tall, masked Death Eater that I was pretty certain was Cantankerous Not pushed through the front door, draped in an enormous snake. He was followed by Mavra and 3 male black court vampires. In her penchant for dressing up for the occasion, she'd worn a bikini and they were wearing shorts. Slightly decayed corpses in bathing suits are very gross. So there's not even a ritual? Crouch asked Nott, moistening his lips with his tongue and twirling his wand absently. No. With the anchors, the enemy, and multiple dark marks all in the same location, the call should have already been made. We simply must do this. He put his wand to his left inner forearm, and I caught a glimpse of the Death Eater tattoo writhing with the silent spell. Thomas at some point had scooted in next to me to peer out as well, and he sighed. You have to stop making so many enemies, Dresden. I shrugged. He wasn't wrong, but it wasn't exactly the right opportunity to make friends. I was just hoping I could get out of this one without burning down a theater full of horny college students. That I'd basically given up on getting out of it without blowing the statute of secrecy was a given. Dead zone, expecto nuntius. I incanted, then ordered Mouse, tell Tonks, Black, Crouch Jr. Mavra, at least 1 other Death Eater and 2 Black Court at the movie theater. They're summoning something. Audience full of muggles. Malfoy's in danger too. I released the silvery dog to go get help. Like most of the times I was out these days, we'd briefed a selection of adults about where we'd be. It was annoying how often it was necessary. You didn't mention us. Thomas raised an eyebrow after I'd sent the Patronus off. I assumed he could see it, but wasn't sure. I only mentioned the Malfoys because the auras might move their butts faster when it's them in danger, I explained. I'll go warn the other wizards. You tell your family and check if it's safe to go out the emergency exit. Take charge attitude, he nodded, seemingly impressed. Will do. I didn't bother to try to lock the doors, since they'd just blow them open or kick them down. Instead, as Thomas slipped toward the front where his sister and cousin were sitting to the side, I waved to catch Mathilda's attention, pointed out into the lobby, and made a fangs gesture by holding my index fingers down in front of my mouth. Even in the darkness toward the back of the theater, I could make out a long-suffering sigh and a nod. She slipped into the aisle to warn her uncle and sisters, while I crept up to the Malfoys. Dresden, what? Lucius hissed, embarrassed that I was squeezing my imposing height in the way down the middle of the theater, nearly stepping on feet of his roommates to come talk to him. Death Eaters in the lobby with Black Court and a big black dog, I whispered as best I could into his ear. It was a calculated risk, but he was either working with his old pals, and this would break his plausible deniability about me getting hurt, or he would be pissed they endangered his family to get at me. I'm going to murder Cantankerous, he swore quietly. Not let you use the theater, I asked. That would have been nice to know earlier. I started extricating myself in a mostly ungainly fashion from the row and glanced over to where Thomas was trying the emergency exit door, only to find it blocked. At this point, with all the wizards and vampires in the audience moving in various kinds of worried ways, the muggles were starting to catch on. especially with the Grimblehawks forming up defensively in the aisle near the exit into the lobby. I moved over and explained exactly what was going on again while the wraiths tried to force the door on the other side of the theater. I didn't know how good Mathilda's sisters were in a fight. Abraham was fairly powerful, but got winded quickly based on the fight I'd seen him in previously. The Malfoys were probably pretty good if they were willing to help out. So we slightly outnumbered our opponents, but they weren't likely to care about collateral damage, and about the only cover we had inside the theater was hiding behind bystanders. We need to try to push into the lobby, I suggested. That would let us control the fight and keep them from just setting the theater on fire. They have to come at us down the vomitorium, though, Edith, Mathilda's oldest sister, argued. But if they do, they'll hit muggles, I tried to explain. Honestly, the strategizing would also be easier if we weren't having to whisper loudly at each other while the students nearby looked on at us in confusion. Before she could offer a rebuttal, one of those students loudly said, "I didn't know this was a 3D movie." I turned to see what he was talking about, and the black-shrouded killer from the movie did, indeed, seem to be emerging from the screen. The trick of perspective fooled me for a moment, but I suddenly realized what they'd been trying to summon by getting me and Sirius Black into the same place. I sighed and explained to the Grimblehawks, "It's Voldemort. Give the White Court vampires their due, they were on the ball." From the still-locked emergency exit door, Lara yelled out in a voice that was honestly better acting than she'd managed for the movie, "Oh no, it's the killer, and the door is locked." She took on the posture of her character, cowering from the apparition, who actually wasn't focused on her at all. Permission to cut loose and play along, I asked Abraham. As the senior ministry representative, I'd need him to speak up if Dawlish came after me for using magic in front of a theater full of muggles. He nodded, so I turned around, drew my unicorn horn focus and announced, "Don't worry, ma'am. I'll banish this ghost." I almost said bust, obviously, but discarded the idea at the last moment as too hammy. Lara's acting was better than mine, at least. I followed it up with Hoc est Corpus. Wraith Voldemort, unfortunately, was more agile than I gave him credit for, narrowly dodging the spell in midair as the blast of Phoenix light seemed to cause some of his trailing, smoky essence to dissipate. I didn't know if he could sense what I was doing, or had figured out during his stints in the castle that I was researching a way to destroy his wraith form. "Dresden," he howled, raising up into the ceiling to try to give himself more room to maneuver. "I didn't know this was a multimedia show," one of the theater-goers explained to his friend. The film projector started to sputter above as I unleashed magic in the room, creating a strobing effect in the theater and probably making it hard to follow the actual murder scene happening in the movie. Voldemort's smoke-like form was difficult to make out in the dark above, visible more as a wispy shadow in the flickers of projector light. The Soulfire charm took a lot out of me, so I couldn't just volley it repeatedly at the wraith of the Dark Lord. "Thilda, can you hurt him with your patronus?" I asked her. "On it," my girlfriend agreed and snapped out, "Expecto Patronum," to send Minnie to fly up to the ceiling. With her being 17 now, she didn't even have to worry about the trace, though it might be nice to have auras show up to investigate underaged magic in a city center. I wondered what the muggles were actually seeing, since they didn't normally see patronuses or dementors. Obviously, they were seeing something where Voldemort was, so his wraith form wasn't that much like a dementor. I was getting ready to take another shot at the wraith, as Mathilda's patronus limited his ability to dodge when FiendFyre washed out of the hallway for the rest of the Grimblehawks to shield against. "Master," Crouch Jr. yelled from the vomitorium, as Edith had called it. That might only apply to the entries into stadium seating, but this was no time to dither over architectural terminology. "Master, it is not time. Come with us," the skinny Death Eater exclaimed, then ran back out into the lobby before anyone could return fire. With the two distractions, I very nearly landed my second Soulfire charm on Voldemort, causing the projector to flicker even worse. Taking the better part of valor, he floated into the ceiling just before my spell struck. "Intangibility is cheating," I yelled. I looked at the Malfoys, who had at least gotten out to the aisle and were dithering over what to do, and I told them, "Protect the bystanders." Abraham nodded. "Good show. Let's try to capture some of them, and then pushed forward with his nieces. I wasn't far behind them, though I was a little winded from multiple apologies in a short period. They weren't any less energy-intensive than the Unforgivables seemed to be. We did a somewhat tactical entry into the theater's lobby, Edith managing a decent-looking shield and the rest of us breaking left, and right as soon as we cleared the door in case someone threw a killing curse our way. The concession stand was up a short set of stairs to our right, the ticket counter across the lobby from us, and the doors out to our left. There wasn't a ton of cover other than a few armchairs and the columns supporting the middle of the building. Fortunately, the bad guys were in the process of evacuating, not waiting in ambush. Up by the concession counter, the giant snake was curled up and spasming as the last of Voldemort's black smoke was absorbed into it. Always with the possessing snakes, that Gainat was looming nearby, next to Black, as usual, in his dog form. Crouch turned and threw some kind of dark curse at us that Edith managed to deflect with her shield. "Time to go," Nott echoed from behind his Death Eater mask. To the left, behind the ticketing counter, Mavra was overseeing her undead himbos as they were drinking from the girl Crouch stunned on the way in. "Leave her, you idiots," she grated at them, before turning and firing her own curse our way that I just lifted one of the plush chairs into the path of. Confringo. Abraham launched his favorite spell at Mavra, and she barely got a shield up in time to cancel out the blasting curse. Fortunately, she didn't deflect it into the walls. The old guy was too used to fighting creatures in open terrain. Exscorio. I tried, apologies focus still in hand, and hoping that any of the targets on the right would be seriously inconvenienced by the exorcism charm. I was honestly hoping to hit Black or the snake, but Crouch jumped in the way, shield up, for all the good it did him. His anguished scream was at least gratifying as the magic connected and ran celestial fire along the cracks in his soul. Behind him, Nott scooped the snake back up and tossed, Crucio, my way, forcing me to duck back behind the chair that was smoldering from Mavra's spell and breaking the spell on Crouch. "Grab the dog and move," the senior Death Eater told him before spinning in place and disapparating with Voldemort and his new host body. Meanwhile, Mathilda had hit one of the vampire minions with a fire-making charm. Between me and her uncle, she was learning some really bad lessons about spells that are appropriate inside non-warded structures. Fortunately, the screaming vampire turned and rushed through the nearby doors to find a place to put himself out without catching the lobby on fire. The second minion was charging for us, giving Mavra distraction to run out after her immolating spawn. Seemingly confused by the whole thing, Black was bounding out the door after them, with Crouch, still messed up by the exorcism, staggering after them, yelling, "No, you moronic dog, come back." Abraham's second blasting curse was more than adequate for an immature vampire charging straight at us, and flaming chunks of the creature got spread around the lobby. Bob had suggested to me that Black Court probably got more magic resistant as they got older, but young ones were only so much kindling if you could light them up before they could get their hands and teeth into you. "That's me tapped, I think," the elder Grimblehawk wheezed. The room free of opponents, Giselle was running across to try to save the girl who'd had her throat torn open by the vampires. Hopefully veterinary healers knew magic that worked on people too. "Come on, Harry," Mathilda insisted, rushing out after the fleeing opponents. As she'd expected, I was right behind her. "Bloody Gryffindors," Edith swore, bringing up the rear. I wasn't sure where she'd been sorted, but she struck me more as a Ravenclaw. Mavra had managed to extinguish her surviving minion, though with only his swim trunks for clothing, he was obviously badly burned. Black was turned and growling next to them, with Crouch still semi-drunkenly charging across the street after them. They weren't in the best spot for physically running from us, with a high fieldstone wall along the length of the road on the other side, broken only by the occasional driveway. It looked like the students at the theater had mostly walked from their various colleges rather than driving, so there weren't even too many cars down the street to provide cover. Before they could figure out whether to try to flee or fight, Mathilda snapped off a spell she'd been working on as part of her Animagus training, Harmorphous. The Animagus reversal spell managed to nail the black dog, and in moments he transformed into a crouching human. Still wearing his Azkaban prison clothing, the emaciated figure was, as expected, clearly the serious black of the wanted posters, including the long, unkempt black hair and beard. He shook his head in confusion, the hair flopping about. Before anyone could react to the transformation, he stumbled to his feet and moved away from the vampires and crouch. I really wasn't expecting him to shout, "Wait! I want to talk. I'm innocent. Blackguard, he's in control when I'm Padfoot, but not when I'm me." Sirius Black slurred, stumbling away from Mavra and her scorched vampire minion. Barty Crouch Jr. was as nonplussed as the rest of us by the sudden turn and stopped in the middle of the road where he'd been trying to corral the dog. We probably should have used the opportunity to attack them, but I think we were just as interested in hearing what he had to say. "I didn't kill those muggles. It was Peter. He would have gotten away as a rat. But I caught him, ate him right up. The Dark Lord made me do it." He then began to cackle madly. "Amateur hour." Mavra rolled her eyes. She muttered something and slashed her wand. I had no idea where she'd been storing it in the bikini, nor did I want to know, sending a blast of purple light at us that we had to scatter to dodge. Then the fight was back on. "Cover," I insisted to Mathilda and Edith. The Grimblehawks broke to either side, Edith making for a car parked in front of the theater to the right, and Mathilda for the trash bins above the stairs down behind the building to the left. I'd stowed my apologies focus and drawn my blasting rod as we'd exited, and I tried a quick incendio to make a gout of flame to keep the vampires from rushing us. It wasn't a big street, and they were fast. "Avada Kedavra," Crouch tried as the two vampires cringed away from my flamethrower and then bit back a cry of anguish, the killing curse fizzling as green sparks from his wand. He staggered back, and I suspected he was still feeling the effects of the exorcism. He recovered quickly enough, tossing a blasting curse my way that I simply dodged, already moving. I heard it shatter one of the doors on the theater behind me as I ran. Tactically, I was in a weird spot. With Black out of the fight, for however long he could fight off the Horcrux's influence, we were technically 3-on-3. But Edith was an accountant, and I suspected she had never been in a real fight before this. Mathilda would keep her head, but she still didn't have a lot of luck with the really powerful combat spells, and I wouldn't necessarily bet my life savings on myself against any of the opponents on the street in a one-on-one fight. But I just needed to not die long enough for Tonks to show up with the cavalry. It was time to break out the chemical augmentation. As I ran across the street, mostly to try to keep their attention from going after the girls, I used my left hand to draw a potion from my utility belt and slugged it back. I grimaced since the flavor was one of the many things I still had to improve, but I'd at least gotten the potion up to doing something in the last couple of months. As the effects of the gummy berry juice, even the muggle-born in my class didn't get my reference to the candy-inspired Disney cartoon, kicked in. Time seemed to slow. I couldn't actually move any faster, so it was a lot like suddenly swimming instead of moving through the air. But I was thinking faster. The two vampires were recovering, and I decided to take out the minion to worry about Mavra with more of my attention. Spells are more about thoughts than incantation, so my somewhat time-slurred Cunfriingo nonetheless managed a proper blasting curse. I was even able to make small adjustments to my aim as I spotted the vampire trying to dodge right. Interesting looking in the slowed time, the coruscating flame of the spell nailed the vampire dead center mass, sending slow-motion chunks down New Battle Terrace. I knew that street name was a problem. Meanwhile, not expecting she could get a spell through their shields, Mathilda was playing a freezing charm across the street behind me, leaving a slick barrier between us and the remaining opponents. She had to break off the charm to dodge chunks of exploded vampire, but I noticed that Edith actually had the reaction time to banish the arm that had been flying toward her back at Crouch. That at least confused the hell out of him. Clearly upset at the loss of her second minion, Mavra had to watch her step for a moment to account for the slick ground, and that gave me time to grab another item I'd been carrying in my utility belt since it became apparent she would keep coming. As the vampire began a mighty leap to clear the ice and pit her superior strength against my frail mortal body, I underhanded the fist-sized plastic bottle into the air between us and managed to hit it with a low-powered exploding charm, the speed potion letting me get it all in line in a way I probably couldn't have at normal speed. Top vampire fighting tip: garlic powder is cheap and plentiful at your local supermarket. Clearly now regretting her dedication to the costuming bit, the cloud of yellowish dust nicely coated all of Mavra's exposed skin around the bikini, and she howled in pain. The trailing shockwave of my charm was enough to push her leaping trajectory a bit. Coupled with me backpedaling and her pulling her arms to her body in pain, she narrowly missed me and rolled to the ground a few feet further down the street. Even covered in chemical burns, the vampire was fast. While I could track her visually as she rolled to her feet and made for cover, I couldn't swing my blasting rod down and around fast enough to nail her in the back, even if I could have marshaled enough magic to punch through her resistance after all the spells I'd been throwing. And then came the distinctive pops of incoming apparition, though the sound was odd in the slowed time. I spotted Tonk's purple hair and red robes down the street one way and the burly, scarred form of Moody the other. Screw this. Crouch. We have to go, Mavra grated out, before spinning in the air to disapparate as a spell from Tonks flashed past her. Moody's red stunner caught the still cackling Sirius Black directly on, but that meant nobody was watching Crouch. The last Death Eater on the scene dived at the collapsing form of the possibly innocent, definitely mad escaped convict and pulled his own disapparition. A whole hunk of matted black hair and an ear were left behind in the road, splinched off of Black in Crouch's haste. My gummy berry juice didn't last long, and Tonks was hustling up as time snapped back to normal for me. Follow them through, she asked the senior aura. Moody shook his head and snarled. Too dangerous. Could be more than we can handle at the apparition point, and Crouch is smart enough to make multiple jumps to make himself harder to follow. I had always figured that the auras had a way of following an apparition, but they kept that spell as secret as possible. Everyone okay? Tonks asked. Muggle got bitten by a vampire inside. Mathilda's sister is trying to heal her. Otherwise, I think we got off okay, I explained, then quickly summarized the rest of what had happened as Mathilda and Edith walked up. Get the Obliviators here, just in case, Moody ordered Tonks. I'll check on the Muggle. As I followed Moody back into the lobby, I couldn't help but smile when I noticed that Tonks' Patronus messenger had transformed into a small, sleek wolf in place of the jackrabbit she'd had previously. I supposed congratulations to Remus were in order. Inside, Abraham was recovering in one of the chairs that hadn't taken spellfire, and Giselle spoke up from the ticketing counter. I've got her stabilized, but we should really get her to St. Mungo's to fix the internal damage. The whole thing had taken only a few minutes, so there were thankfully no more muggles that had wandered into the lobby in the meantime. I'll have Tonks take her, Moody agreed, frowning at the damage to the lobby, as well as the chunks of the vampire Abraham had blasted apart. How are the rest of you with repair and cleaning charms? After that, the ministry did what it did best and covered up a supernatural fracas. More auras showed up, some of them specialized in memory charms, and the theater was basically as good as new by the time people started to exit the screening, just in time to be magically persuaded that the movie had just been broken up by a fun little live-action, special effects show that didn't bear further consideration. All the wizards and White Court got interviewed, and having Abraham's testimony backing mine, not to mention Mathilda and her sisters, meant even if Dawlish had been invited to the scene, he wouldn't have much to accuse me of. Apparently, I wasn't supposed to just blow up vampires as a matter of course, but Mavra was enough of a known criminal that with the assault on the Muggle, being in the middle of breaking the statute, and arguable self-defense hot pursuit, it would square with the ministry laws. Nobody yet was enough of an expert on the Unseelie Accords, but if Mavra wanted to walk into the ministry to demand recompense under the new interspecies rules, Moody thought that would just be hilarious. It's a shame John invoked the doom on you, Dresden, Moody told me as everyone was wrapping up. None of the rest of the kids about to graduate from Hogwarts are going to be worth a damn as auras. Hell, I might as well go ahead and retire. You ever think about going into the private investigation business? I joked. Now there's a thought. He regarded me more seriously than I'd expected for a beat too long and then said, well, you better get on. Yeah, we have a hotel to get to, Mathilda stated, taking my arm. No way, Tonks disagreed, striding up behind her. After what happened tonight, you two need to go straight back to Hogwarts. It's my birthday, she said, and Tonks' hair flickered blue in surprise as she picked up on the subtext. Moody had picked up on it as well and explained. Hard to maintain constant vigilance when you're doing that kind of thing. Hotel rooms not safe. We apparently looked so put out that Tonks took pity on us. Remus is still at the school for the break, and his house is still under the Fidelius, which I think you're keyed into, Grimblehawk. I can't believe I'm telling you two to go have sex at my boyfriend's house. You're the best, Tonks, Mathilda exclaimed. Moody was just chuckling but advised. Apparate straight there. Wait, do you even have your apparition license? I will soon. I explained, then grabbed Mathilda and disapparated with her before they could ask any more questions. We actually only went a few blocks, since I did need to check out of the hotel early. There was not a refund, sadly, but I could tell that I'd scored points by picking a reasonably nice place. From there, it was a short trip to the nearby Rath to jump back to Hogsmeade, and then just use the 3 broomsticks flew to get to Remus. No need to risk splinching ourselves like had happened to Black. Finally, we tumbled out into the mostly emptied study of the house I hadn't lived in for nearly a year. Remus had clearly put most of his stuff into storage or moved it into his Hogwarts apartment, and the house was slightly eerie to navigate through with everything missing or under furniture covers. We lit our rings to see by, though, and if it was a little chilly in the house, we were soon planning to warm each other up. My bedroom still had a bed in it, and the sheets were nicely folded in the linen closet. I don't know how making your own bed is for normal foreplay, but the bedclothes went on and the people clothes went off in one continuous process that we both seemed to find outrageously funny. It might have been the adrenaline crash from the fight finally catching up to us. Finally, blissfully, we were beneath the blankets. You're sure? I asked one more time. Obviously, Harry, she agreed. Even though we're basically in a horror movie and slipping upstairs in an abandoned house to have sex is the last thing we should be doing. Harry Dresden, this is not a horror movie, it's a love story. But if you're super worried, you can keep your rod handy, she smirked. Very deliberately, I reached off the bed and pulled my blasting rod from my belt and set it on the nightstand in each reach. Yes, ma'am. Rolling her eyes, she initiated a closer embrace, leaning in for a kiss and joking. Well, if anyone asks, at least I can say you used protection.